Chapter 1437. The breeding area for the multi-headed lizards was located in the upper part of the lower city of Valhalla. It was under the strict surveillance of the White Lion Guards. Even if there were spies among the craftsmen and magical beast breeders, it would not be a big deal. In comparison, the extra manpower was what Valhalla needed the most. Even if they were on loan, they could use them to cultivate a large number of qualified talents during the loan period. Your Highness Levin, Valhalla is a new city, and naturally welcomes every builder. Amandina's expression did not change as she spoke in an official tone, but then she changed the topic. But will Count Grey Mountain agree? In the Battle of Ampere Seal, did the Black Blade Squad lose at the hands of the Lord? Levin Oneson smiled slightly and did not mind Amandina's attitude. He replied, "The Earl of Grey Mountain's health has been deteriorating since the Battle of Ampere Seal. Now, his eldest son has actually taken over the daily affairs of the territory. The latter is my best friend, and he also has a sister who has a good impression of you. In addition, although the situation in Erewhon is still divided after the Battle of the North and South, people with discerning eyes can see that this division will not last for long. The chaos since the Year of Frost is coming to an end, and the chances of another conflict in Erewhon in the future are not high. In fact, it was this gentleman who intended to close the few magical beast nests in the Grey Mountain. I think he will be happy to sit down and talk to you about this business. If that's the case, it would be great." Amandina's face was calm, but there was a hint of joy in her voice. With more manpower, it meant that the breeding of the multi-headed lizards could be expanded, and it would also save a lot of trouble. For Valhalla, this was tantamount to borrowing an urgent need. "Who is this lady?" "Her name is Edney, and she has just returned from the Cruise Empire." Amandina thought about the name for a moment, and her heart immediately understood. The group walked forward, and Edessa whispered to the prince about what they saw along the way. The breeding area for the lizards was located in the central area of Valhalla, made up of crisscrossing tree holes and hulls. The serpentine lizards had a strong sense of community, so they were often separated from each other. Amandina had tried to train the serpentine lizard cavalry, but all of them failed. She could only ask Tamar to create special armor for them so that they could fight alone. The first batch of adult serpentine lizards had a total of about 60 of them. Most of them were already equipped with specialized armor. These armors did not have any special abilities. They were simply thick and heavy. Serpentine lizards had an extremely strong regenerative ability. Coupled with their powerful defense, they would be invincible on the battlefield. When the noble emissary from the north saw the huge monsters covered in steel armor like moving fortresses, he couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. His eyes revealed a dignified look. "Miss Amandina, what do you think of the recent meeting in the Wilderness of Four Territories?" Levin Ornesson asked. Amandina was stunned. Even though the news of the Wild Conference of the Four Realms still hadn't spread, everyone who understood the inside story knew that an era of war and chaos was about to arrive. Valhalla's mobilization of troops might not necessarily be for this reason. Every time this happened, she sincerely admired Brando's foresight. His lordship seemed to have foreseen the arrival of this day. "I'm afraid that the future will be difficult to stabilize, Your Highness." "Yes, now that mysterious armies have appeared everywhere, and the activities of magic creatures have become more frequent. The climate is abnormal, the crops are failing, and the arrival of the magic tide predicted by astrologers. All these signs indicate that the world is entering an era of chaos. News of war and unrest in Cruz has spread widely in the north, and I believe that it is not groundless. Unfortunately, only a few people think like you, Your Highness Levin. Most people in Erewhon are unaware of this. You and Princess Griffin are dedicated to healing the rift between the nobles of the north and south, but the situation in Erewhon will not change because of this. Many people in the region see this peace talk as a negotiation between the royal family and the region to redivide the benefits. They are either indifferent, or afraid that their interests will be infringed, and are ready to join forces with each other, ready to take action. The royal faction's activities in the south could not be hidden from the eyes and ears of those who were observant. Besides, there were no secrets in the noble circles of this era. Amandina had long known that there was an undercurrent of opposition to her and Princess Griffine among the upper nobles of Erewhon. Even though these people were not a big deal, it was inevitable that they were annoying. The nobles of Erewhon are used to limiting their vision to this small kingdom, and it is difficult for them to see what is happening outside of Erewhon. But in the country, their hands are stretched far enough, Amandina replied sarcastically. She looked at Levin, and even though there had always been rumors about the wisdom of this prince, she said mercilessly, "Your Highness Levin, I think that House Cipher, as the natural leader of the nobles in the north, needs to set an example and broaden the vision and mind of the nobles in the kingdom. The Holy Cathedral of Fire has sent an envoy not long ago to invite Erewhon to participate in the conference in the Wilderness of Four Territories. I think most of the other countries have also received the invitation. In fact, a small part of the reason why we are negotiating with Madara is for the future war." Although Levin one's son could not see, he still felt Amandina's gaze. He smiled and shook his head. "Miss Amandina, I am here for this." Amandina actually knew some of the details of the Second Peace Conference in Ampere Seal. She was one of the decision-makers on Brando's side, and the princess trusted her and did not hide anything from her. However, she faintly felt that Her Royal Highness and His Royal Highness were oversimplifying things. She looked at the ambitious eldest prince and frowned. She thought that he really couldn't wait to come here. Power was indeed the sweetest poison in the world. However, this was the royal family's business, and Amandina was not willing to intervene too much, so as not to leave the impression that the Lord was a powerful minister. From the bottom of her heart, of course, she would prefer for the Lord to have a political marriage with the princess, and become the legitimate king of Erewhon as a prince. But Amandina knew what her lord was thinking. He would never take advantage of someone in such a precarious situation. Levin one's son did not care, and he suddenly asked, "Miss Amandina, if you were to lead this country, how would you deal with these people?" Amandina suddenly became alert, frowning and asked, "I don't quite understand what you mean, Your Highness Levin." "Don't worry, that's just a hypothesis. I want to hear your opinion. I will cut the Gordian knot, but Her Highness can't make up her mind." I have known Griffine for a long time. She is very opinionated, but too soft-hearted and idealistic. It's just that the Erewhon of this era does need some idealism, because only such idealism can gather the destitute people's hearts again, such as Mr. Brando. Amandina was silent. She, who was relatively rational, had never been able to understand such emotional things, but there were indeed so many idealistic people gathered around the Lord, and even she was willing to do so. Perhaps in this world, there was a third answer besides right and wrong. Amandina shook her head and got rid of this thought. Seeing that Amandina was silent, Levin one's son did not ask further and just smiled indifferently. In his opinion, this sister of his was steady and capable, rational and firm, just like him, which was probably inherited from the Cipher family. However, she still lacked some long-term vision, but this was not a problem. With the assistance of the Count, she would become a better ruler sooner or later. He could not help but think of Brando's proposal, and his heart was full of admiration for the young Count who had been famous for a long time. Perhaps only a person with such a mind could have such foresight and vision. The conversation between the two came to an end, and the group gradually approached the 6th and 7th area. Amandina soon saw a green-haired girl standing beside two snake lizards with her snow-white ankles bare, her hands on their bodies. Her eyes were closed, and her dreamy green long hair was scattered to the ground, but it was spotless. The two snake lizards obediently bowed in front of the girl, and did not look like they had lost control as they had previously claimed. Seeing this scene, even the light spirit was surprised. Edessa was saying something to her prince in surprise, and the two envoys from the north were also stunned. Amandina knew the girl's identity. Her name was Sifrit, and she was the little girl that the Lord had saved from Hades. The Druids believed that this little girl was the daughter of the forest, the goddess of nature, Medea's chosen one. For the past 3 years, she had been receiving Druid education in the loop of trade winds. She was now almost 14 years old, and her figure had become taller and more slender. She was no longer the little girl who had not yet shed her childishness, and her body showed a sacred aura. Sister Amandina. Siffred heard footsteps and opened her eyes to look back. Her beautiful appearance made the 2 envoys unable to move their eyes away. Her new green eyes were spotless, like flawless crystals. Her skin was whiter than snow, and her long eyelashes were hazy like a dream. She was like a goddess of the forest. Amandina hugged her. Amandina knew that this child had deep feelings for Valhalla, and treated her and the Lord as her family. Her father had passed away from an illness a year ago, and her feelings for Valhalla had become even more lonely. Amandina patted Siffred's forehead lovingly and asked, "Are you all right, Siffred?" Chapter 1438. It's fine. The serpentine lizards were only startled. I calmed them down and they were fine. Siffred replied. She had already surpassed her master and stood out from the rest of the Druids. As if to prove the prophecy of the daughter of the forest, Siffred was able to communicate with animals and listen to the sounds of the forest. Druids could only communicate with wild beasts, but Siffred was able to understand the language of monsters and plants. She was now one of the most powerful Druids in the Withering Tree Council, and her position was only below a few great Druids. The Grand Elder also wanted to pass the position to her, but she volunteered to come to Valhalla when she heard that the monster's nest was in trouble. Right now, Siffred was not only the leader of all the magical beasts in the Serpentine Lizard Farm, but she was also in charge of Valhalla's agricultural production. Almost all the Druids in Ferber obeyed her commands, and her position in Count Trenthium's hierarchy was second only to Amandina and a few others. "Thank you, Siffred." Amandina replied sincerely. "This is what I should do, Sister Amandina." Siffred replied modestly. Siffred paused for a moment and looked at Levin Onessen's direction. Amandina noticed her expression and realized something. She lowered her voice and asked, "What is it, Siffred?" "Sister Amandina, the workers accidentally entering the hatchery was just a trigger for the serpentine lizards to go berserk." "Is it still the same matter?" Siffred nodded. Amandina frowned. The secret plan was one of Valhalla's top secrets. It originated from a report by Monique, the light spirit of Valhalla. The report mentioned that Valhalla was slowly recovering. In the ancient times, the stronghold was a part of the world tree. It was not an inanimate object to begin with, and its recovery could be said to be an orderly process of growth. Amandina thought of the possibility that the light spirit mentioned. Even though she was not sure if Monique was exaggerating, but if it was successful, it would be a great change for Valhalla. But that was a matter for the future. Right now, the serpentine lizards were becoming restless. If this continued, it would only be a matter of time before outsiders found out about it. Of course, this plan could not be known to outsiders. Amandina glanced at Levin and the others not far away, thinking that what the king's eldest son saw should be the open secret of Valhalla. She patted Siffred's shoulder and gestured for her to follow her. "So Valhalla can fly." Amandina and Siffred met Monique in Valhalla's central mana pool. The light spirit had not left this place for a month. The nest of the light spirits, the vortex of light, was also placed in this place. At this time, Valhalla already had 3 complete mana pools. A steady flow of mana was sent into the vortex of light. Every few minutes, a light spirit would be born from it. Monique monitored the operation of the vortex of light while answering Amandina's question. "It's impossible for it to fly for the time being. Don't even think about it before we have 1, 2, 3, 12 mana pools to send mana. Even though the strongholds of the divine folk in the past were all floating, it's already good enough for us to be able to make it move. How long will that take? Amandina asked with a frown. The lower city is close to Valhalla's root system. The huge amount of energy from the root system will attract the attention of others sooner or later, and the monsters in the nests are beginning to feel uneasy. I can have Valhalla set up an isolation layer. Monique thought for a moment and replied. Forget it, we don't have that much mana to waste. Is there any other way? Amandina knew that Valhalla needed a lot of mana every time it evolved. This mana could originally be supported by the mana ores excavated from the Black Forest, but with the growth of Valhalla, the mana ores that were originally surplus for export had now begun to be imported. Fortunately, there was the Cold Dew Queen's Alliance on the Shining Sea. Her shining scale Nagas guarded this route all year round, so that Tanajal's ocean trade would not be interrupted by the chaos in the north. To speed up the evolution of Valhalla, in addition to increasing the source of mana, we can also increase the efficiency of mana transmission. This is also a disguised way to increase the input of mana. Monique thought for a moment and said, aren't you studying that mana transmission device? How about this, I'll have Valhalla open a new hall, just under the moon pool. We'll build a mana transmission hall there, and let the mana of the moon pool be converted by your devices before it enters the veins of the world tree. Converting mana could indeed increase the efficiency of mana use. This was also the principle of the Hazel magic devices. They purified the mana that could only be purified by wizards through the means of runes, so that mortals could also use mana. In fact, the more powerful a wizard was, the higher the efficiency of mana purification. The external manifestation of this was that he could master more powerful magic, and the more advanced the magic devices were. Although the new generation of magic devices developed by Amandina was not yet comparable to the cutting-edge technology represented by the Hazel people in this era, under Brando's suggestion, it had far surpassed the first generation of Erewhon magic devices that she had created in history. However, Amandina was not confident about that. Although her talent in magical device design may far exceed her ability in internal affairs, the greater the expectation, the more anxious she would be. The thing I designed has not been tested yet. Amandina said. It doesn't matter, Monique replied casually. Practical application is the best experiment. We light spirits have always done this. May I ask, do you light spirits often have accidents? Well, Monique thought for a moment. Occasionally, a few people will die. Amandina's face showed deep suspicion. She doubted the counting ability of these light spirits. How many times did they mean by occasionally? How many people did they really die? Maynard carefully turned a 14-leafed Amandina and the pottery pot in which it was planted. She crossed her arms and squinted her eyes to admire the way the sun shone through the glass window on its spikes. The bright sun made the ink bottle on the desk shine and cast a shadow under the feather of the quill pen. On the map bound with thread at the side, the needle on the copper-plated pocket watch's dial had just passed 3 o'clock. Every piece of furniture on the desk was not neatly arranged. It was the complete opposite of Amandina, who was meticulous in everything. It was as if the arrangement had been carefully designed, reflecting the unusual interests of the hostess. A claw carefully opened the door and a chubby head poked in. The two eyes on the head blinked and stared at the hostess in the room with a bit of fear. Come in. The female knight seemed to have sensed someone opening the door. She turned around and replied with a smile, Don't worry, I'm not here to talk to you about the magic crystal theft case from a few days ago. I didn't do it. Sheeta quickly waved her claws and said in a sharp voice, I didn't go to the Stars warehouse. Oh, so there's still the Stars warehouse. It seems like I have to have someone check it. The little fat dragon's eyes were filled with panic and it almost ran away in fear. Impossible, I definitely didn't do it in the other places. I swear, I only went to the Stars warehouse and there was an evil thief framing me. You just denied it. Miss Maynard, that is, then it saw the dangerous smile on the female knight's face. Call me Lord. Maynard gave an angry snort. Lord Knight. Sheeta revealed a dejected look, but it didn't dare go against the words of this terrifying demoness. It could only squeeze its round body into the room. Maynard frowned as she looked at the creaking door frame and wondered if it would announce its retirement. Why don't you turn into a human, Sheeta? Since the dragon god's betrayal, it has been like this. Sheeta dejectedly replied, the power of the dragons is declining day by day. God, this is such a bad era. But why isn't Lady Mithril like this? Maynard thought of Mithril who had sent it back from Dragon Island. It was the Silver Dragon Lady who had sent the information about the disaster in the north to Valhalla. She is an adult dragon, Lord Maynard. I am just a pitiful little guy. In terms of horizontal area, you aren't small at all. Maynard snappily teased. Sheeta's face showed shame and anger, but it didn't have the courage to bare its fangs and brandish its claws. Over the past month, since Lady Amandina handed it over to this terrible knight, it found that its good days were over. The latter's endless means almost cost it half its life. It didn't know that there was a gap between its knowledge and that of this mortal lady. The latter had once managed a huge guild, while it was just a baby dragon that had been hiding in a glacier for hundreds of years. Sheeta, Maynard knocked on the desk. Have you thought about accompanying Prince Haruz on his diplomatic mission to Lantern Island? Oh, that. I'll think about it again. The female knight looked coldly at the guy who was too lazy to move and said, then we can only talk about the theft case at Star's pet chain supermarket. No. The little fat dragon screamed, you said not to talk about this, Lord Maynard. Yes, I originally wanted to talk about Prince Haruz, but you chose to refuse this topic, didn't you? Sheeta almost wanted to bang its head on the ground when it heard this. It wailed in pain, this is despicable coercion. That's pretty much it. The little fat dragon straightened its body. It almost wanted to rebel against the tyranny, but the moment it met Maynard's smiling gaze, the young dragon turned back into a little sheep. All right, I agree. That's good, Maynard replied with a smile, this way, when Lady Hipamra comes back, maybe I'll have forgotten a lot of things. Sheeta couldn't help but let out another wail. Chapter 1439. After Sheeta swayed his round body and left, the smile on Maynard's face faded. She pulled open the drawer. Lying in the drawer was a report. The title page of the report was painted with 3 red lines, signifying urgency, and emblazoned with a black pine leaf coat of arms, signifying that the report was from Grimoires. Roscoe is in contact with a mysterious force. Allium Japonicum pondered for a moment. This report came from Silverman scouts, so it was quite credible. There were almost no secrets around the nobles in this era, and the fact that the Duke of Grimoires met a stranger naturally could not be hidden from those who were interested. The first thing that came to Baijia's mind was the all-for-one's actions. Grimoires was located at the border, and had always been one of the most active provinces of the pagans. However, after the trip to the deadly frost forest, Sophie, subconsciously, she still preferred that name, intervened. Princess Griffin carried out a purge of the armies and knight orders in the southern border. The pagans, especially the all-for-one's power, had greatly shrunk, and were no longer at their peak. But could this be a sign of their resurgence? The situation in the southern border was complicated, and it could even be said that it was in the throes of the unification of the kingdom. The various forces were mixed together, and it was not impossible for the all-for-one to take advantage of this situation to make contact with the Duke of Grimoires. Thinking of this, Baijia took out the report from the drawer and sat back on the chair. She spread out a letter and began to write. The original copy of this report had to be sent to Her Highness for review. But she also planned to write another letter to transfer the royal knight orders from Vladipus to Dry Needle Castle in Ranner. After the Battle of Ampere Seal, the former head of the Royal Night Orders, died of illness. As the captain of the Night Guards, she was promoted to deputy head after Cruz's diplomatic mission and took over the daily affairs of the Night Orders. However, the military movement of the Night Orders still required Count Oberway's joint confirmation, so she had to write a report to the latter. Paperwork was one of the most mundane tasks for a noble, and Brando had always avoided it whenever he could. This was why Falerne and Amandina had always complained about it. However, to Bai Jia, this little bit of paperwork was nothing compared to the official gaming guilds in his previous life that were influenced by modern paperwork. She didn't even need the assistance of specialized civilian staff. This was also to prevent the news from being leaked. She didn't trust the so-called secrecy of this era. The room was soon filled with the sound of scribbling. However, after only 2 lines, Allium Japonicum stopped writing and frowned. Is this really all for one's conspiracy? She tapped her forehead with a pen. She and Brando both had memories from their previous lives. They were very clear about the organization and composition of All for One, and also understood how they did things. Therefore, All for One in this era had no secrets in their eyes. However, Bai Jia doubted that they could recover in such a short time and reorganize the effective underground network. Allium Japonicum reopened the report and read it word by word. Soon, her frown deepened. 3 people. This doesn't seem like the style of All for One. It's too ostentatious. Could it be some other cult, or the undead of Madara? Bai Jia ruled out the possibilities in her mind one by one, but she was soon caught in a whirlpool. Erwin didn't have such a force. Who was the other party? She carefully closed the report, rubbed her forehead and sat back in her chair. She thought to herself that this was really an eventful time. Not only this mysterious force, but since the autumn harvest, or more accurately, since the fall of the Black Moon, there had been continuous reports of comets and the reappearance of underground ruins in various places. This was an event that had never been mentioned in history. The reappearance of ancient ruins seemed to indicate something. There were varying degrees of panic in the north and various provinces south of Ampere Seal. Bai Jia tried to link it to the Slate War, but the clues were fragmented, and a faint uneasiness lingered in her heart. Therefore, she strengthened the deployment of Haru's diplomatic team to Lantern Island. This diplomatic mission was to congratulate the new Duke of Lantern Island, a loyal supporter of Tanagel's faction, Iko, and his wife. It was because less than half a month ago, this young duke had a daughter. His wife had given birth to a baby girl for his family. Even though it was only a baby girl, she was the only new member of the Ophelia family in the past 10 years. Thus, the significance of this was extraordinary. Iko and his wife even named the baby girl Alara, which meant hope in the mountain language. They hoped that the family could walk out of the turmoil and uneasiness since the Frost Rebellion and prosper from now on. And this diplomatic mission was the best opportunity for Tanagel's faction and Her Royal Highness to strengthen the relationship between Lantern Island and Princess Griffin. Princess Griffin even hoped to take this opportunity to discuss a marriage, and appoint one of the future members of the royal family to be the husband of the newborn baby girl. In order to show enough importance, the candidate for the diplomatic mission was carefully considered. Originally, the best candidate should have been Brando. This Count Randner had a close personal relationship with the young duke, and at the same time was the banner of Tanagel's faction. Whether in terms of status or identity, it was just right. However, because Brando was not in Erewhon at the moment, the identity of the envoy was finally obtained by Prince Haruz. It was said that His Royal Highness personally proposed it, and his sister, the current Princess Regent of Erewhon, could not bear to disobey his wishes, so she agreed to the request. Fortunately, His Royal Highness personally acted as the envoy, which was enough to show the importance of Duke Lantern Island's faction. In the end, Bai Jia used a quill pen to tap on the snow-white letter. After hesitating for a moment, she added a sentence at the end of the letter: I suggest that the White Lion Legion's 11th column be moved to Enrich. After the Battle of Ampere Seal, The 11th and 12th columns of the White Lion Legion, which had been reorganized, now had a scale of 15,000 people. They were the most elite combat force of the White Lion Legion. A large number of the legions were filled with the first and second class of the Royal Academy of Sergeants. The captain was a member of the royal family loyal to Her Royal Highness, and the vice-captain was one of the three heroes of Erewhon, Loka. They were a force that the royal family could completely trust. These two columns were currently stationed in Ampere Seal, preparing for the upcoming Second North-South Peace Conference. However, because they had already expected unexpected situations, it was fine to temporarily transfer one of them away. After writing the entire letter, Allium Japonicum carefully checked it again. After confirming that there were no mistakes, she took out the envelope and carefully put it in. She dripped wax on it and used the seal ring to make a fire seal. Then, she pinned a coat of arms that represented the level of the letter and cast a magic seal on it. Finally, she reached out and shook the bell on the desk. "Send it to Lord Oberway." The attendant nodded without saying a word, carefully put away the letter, and then turned to leave. Allium Japonicum watched the attendant close the door, then looked away. She put the copy of the magic seal on the letter into the drawer. When she closed the drawer again, she let out a slight sigh of relief. "I hope nothing goes wrong." She sighed faintly. This scene was familiar. In that dream, she also felt powerless. The helplessness of Erewhon's ending pierced her heart deeply. Perhaps the other soul in her body also had the same thoughts. She looked out the window behind her, but silently thought in her heart, "Where are you now, Sophie?" The sky seemed to be covered by a layer of dark clouds. In the past summer and autumn, there was not a single drop of rain. But at this moment, the thick clouds were shuttling back and forth, and the purple light constantly illuminated the vast mountains of the Alkash Mountains. A winding road between the mountains led to the dark fortress. The towering buildings were like a black kingdom that rose from the ground. There was a gap of tens of miles in the valley, and the broken sword-like tower rose from the gap, straight into the clouds. The dark side of the tower was like an insurmountable precipice. Countless towers, fortresses, and acropolises were scattered along the ridge line, stretching for tens of miles. One after another, the envoys from all over the world were stunned by what they saw. When did the cruise people make such a terrible thing? Only a few people knew the inside story. They inquired about the origin of the historical buildings from other sources. The envoys of various countries were escorted into the fortress by the cruise knight. After exchanging official documents, they were led by the cruise officials to tour the legendary fortress. The visitors were divided into two distinct sides. The envoys of the countries that believed in the Holy Cathedral of Fire were worried because of the disaster that happened in the Empire. The other side was not much better. The large group of envoys from St. Hossel was composed of more than 30 people. Everyone in the group was gloomy because of the huge fortress that suddenly appeared on their border. In this group of envoys, the young hunter Yeruta from the Lantan Island province was among them. But compared to the gloomy faces of the wind elves and humans around him, Yeruta just frowned slightly and seemed to have something on his mind. They were led by the cruise knight to the wall of the fortress. There had just been a small-scale battle here. The tower was scattered with large and small crystal fragments. The wounded were being treated, and the wizards were recharging the fortress's defensive facilities. Since the cruise people reactivated the fortress, such an intense battle had occurred more than a dozen times a day. Chapter 1440. Under the dark sky not far away, the valley to the north of the fortress had undergone tremendous changes in just a few days. The originally desolate ridge was now covered with huge clusters of crystals. There were so many of them that it was impossible to count. The army of crystals was spread all over the valley. From time to time, there would be flying crystals hovering over the valley. When there were enough of them, they could even form a torrent in the sky. The sharp screeching of the crystals echoed in the valley. It was a deafening noise that made the faces of the envoys from various countries change. These days, there were many people like them. Some of them had even come to the top of the wall to observe the scene outside for the third or fourth time. Some of them had even experienced the battle in the past 2 days. Most of them looked worried. "Gentlemen, this is the enemy that the people of Cruz are facing now," Jodin and Idivan stood on the wall and said to everyone. "As most of you have guessed, they are the minions of dusk. In fact, these minions have already defeated the people of Cruz once in the Empire. With the help of this fortress, we barely managed to gain a foothold and stop them from going south. I am not saying this to claim credit. I am asking for your help because this is not the enemy of Cruz alone. On the contrary, their purpose is to destroy our world and kill everyone here. The people of Cruz are not afraid of death. If necessary, we will calmly fight here to the last man. But after that, these monsters will cross the Al-Kash Mountains and attack the wilderness of the 4 territories, the Silver Bay area, and the hinterland of Saint Tassol. This is not an exaggeration, but something that is happening right in front of our eyes. I would like to ask you to think about this question carefully. Are you willing to repeat the mistakes of the Empire, or stop the enemy from entering the country before all this happens?" Little Nidivan's words caused a commotion in the crowd. The envoys from various countries whispered to each other. Soon, someone asked, "Thank you for the sacrifices made by the descendants of the Flame King, but what do you need?" "We need a lot. Weapons, supplies, and even soldiers. But we need more than that. We need everyone to unite and even re-implement the sacred covenant of the past. With all due respect, Mr. Nidwin, is our enemy really so strong that we need the entire civilized world to unite to fight against it?" Nidwin recognized that the speaker was an envoy from a small country to the east of White Mountain. The latter was a country that believed in the Holy Cathedral of Wind. However, the question should not have been asked by the Wind Elves, but by the latter himself. He replied, "In fact, even if we work together, we only have the hope of winning." Everyone couldn't help but gasp. Although they all understood what the name of the Twilight Dragon meant, they had long forgotten the terrifying meaning of this name after thousands of years. In their imagination, the most tragic war was the War of the Holy Saints 1,000 years ago. However, in that war, the 4 sages had also obtained victory. Although there were no more sages in this era, the strength of the various mortal kingdoms was far stronger than that of the Iron Folk of that era. And this time, the White-Eyed People and the Dragon Tribe would also stand on their side. However, Nidwin's words dispelled most of the people's dreams. Although there were still some people who didn't believe him, at least they had more or less an impression of the enemy they were about to face. Some people wanted to retreat because of this, but most people knew in their hearts that in this war, they had no way to retreat. At this time, someone in the Wind Elf envoy finally spoke. "The elves have no objection to this. But there is a problem. This fortress is so close to the border of the Wind Elves and is far away from the traditional sphere of influence of the Cruz people. It is understandable that you temporarily occupy this fortress to fight against the Crystal Cluster, but when the elves' reinforcements arrive, who will be in charge of this fortress?" This sudden question made little Nidwin frown, but he had already expected it. He calmly replied, "I don't think this fortress belongs to anyone." "Then what do you mean?" "This fortress has been passed down since ancient times. It can be said that Lady Martha left a gift to all of us mortals. Therefore, it does not belong to any mortal kingdom, but it also belongs to each of us here. In this war, we will use it together to resist the invasion of foreign enemies. After the war, the Kurlutz people will withdraw from this fortress, and the other countries should do the same one by one. This will be a permanent neutral area. All countries can send scholars to inspect and study it, but no army is allowed to enter." Little Nidwin paused. "This is also the opinion of the original owner of this place." "The original owner of this place?" "Yes, Mr. Tuman. This sentence made everyone who still had objections subconsciously shut their mouths. However, little Nidwin understood that this was just the beginning. Others might not agree with this proposal. Even if the Tower of Babel was only a remnant of the ruins, it was still an endless treasure trove. However, this proposal was beneficial to the Wind Elves. Even if it was a permanent neutral area, no one could deny the fact that it was geographically closer to the Elves of St. Osol. Little Nidwin thought that perhaps this would encourage the Wind Elves to support his proposal. Thinking of this, he raised his head and glanced at a tower in the distance. In the tower, two old men were talking. They were also looking away from the distant city wall. The reactions of the elves of St. Osol and the envoys of other countries were not too unexpected. It seems that things are going well on the surface, but it is only on the surface. Just as Mr. Tuman predicted, the elves of St. Osol still lack trust in us. This does not involve the details. I am afraid that the next negotiation will be more difficult than expected. The reaction of the elves is not beyond my expectations, but I noticed something interesting. I am afraid that this matter is not as simple as it seems. The old Prime Minister of the Empire was silent for a moment before he slowly opened his mouth and replied. Oh. Vala was a little surprised. He knew that the old man in front of him had sharp eyes. In a sense, the two of them were once on different sides. However, during the old man's heyday, Vala did not deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as him. That was his teacher's era. However, in that era, his teacher was only a defeated opponent of the old man in front of him. One of the hunter's siblings who have high hopes for Mr. Tuman is in this envoy group. However, when the elves spoke just now, they did not seek his opinion. Either they have reached an agreement beforehand, or there is something else. You are saying that the hunter's siblings who have high hopes for Mr. Tuman have not truly grasped the situation in St. Osol? That is only a possibility, Mr. Archpriest. However, the possibility is very high. Because even if the elves have reached an agreement with their new king, they would at least show the appropriate respect before they speak. Old Nydevan shook his head. From the looks of it, rather than saying that the entourage of the Elven Envoy group is that Mr.'s entourage, it would be more appropriate to say that they are monitors. The political struggle in St. Osol is not any easier than ours. Back then, it was because we interfered with the internal strife of the sun, moon, and star races that we incurred the hostility between the two countries. It is indeed a little too difficult for the hunter siblings to reclaim a country just because they hold Mr. St. Osol's token, unless the siblings are also skilled politicians. Vala shook his head. That was a little too difficult. He had inquired about the origins of the hunter siblings. They were from a very ordinary family of hunters in Lantern Island. It was hard to say if people of such a background were educated, and it was even more impossible for them to become skilled politicians. In other words, the possibility of them being puppets is greater. He replied. It is a pity that Mr. Tuman still has high hopes for the hunter siblings. Perhaps Mr. Tuman is the one with the most authority. Old Nydevan replied neither too quickly nor too slowly. Things developed as the old Prime Minister expected. The progress of the Wilderness of the Four Realms meeting was not satisfactory. Every country had their own plans on this issue. In the beginning of the meeting, the elves of St. Osol started a tug-of-war over the ownership of the stronghold. Above the ownership of the fortress was the issue of the ownership of the command of the coalition forces. On this issue, even the Kurlutzians did not dare to give in, and the meeting fell into a difficult stalemate after the initial flourish. Even so, the elves still kept their promise and sent an army to join the battle against the crystal clusters before November. At the same time, in the south of the Wilderness of the Four Realms, the elven army signed a ceasefire agreement with the people of Cruz. This allowed the people of Cruz to receive aid from the Red Army from the south for the first time. Under such circumstances, the stronghold barely held on under the siege of the Crystal Cluster Army. However, as time passed, more and more people became aware that the Crystal Cluster army in the mountains north of the Alkash Mountains was brewing a larger operation. With the constant mobilization of the Crystal Cluster army, the number of flying crystal clusters and beetles hovering over the stronghold increased. The hidden conspiracy behind it was like a dark cloud shrouding everyone's heart. Under such oppressive negotiations, the elves finally relented and made a final concession on the issue of command. But it was at this time that the undead army led by Queen Madara finally arrived in the south of White Mountain and sent an envoy to participate in the peace meeting. Chapter 1441. He didn't expect this incident to cause such a huge uproar. Compared to the hatred between the Wind Elves, Fanzan, and Cruz, the hatred between the Elves of Saint Tassol and the Undead of Madara could only be as deep as a sea of blood. Since the first war of the Gravel Valley in the Year of Tether, the Elves and the Undead repeatedly fought in the area south of White Mountain. The scale of these wars was almost larger and bloodier than the conflict between Erwin and Madara. Countless elves slept in the land south of White Mountain. Even 40 years ago, the elves lost an elven king in that war. Since Madara's second expansion in history, its main direction of attack was east of Saint Tassol, and finally opened up a passage to the Alkash Mountains. In this time and space, although the hatred between the two sides had not reached the point of death, it was not to be outdone. Other countries that lived in the light also had doubts about this dark kingdom. Therefore, on the topic of the alliance with the undead, even the Cruz people, who needed support the most at this moment, could not help but shrink back. However, the people of Fanzan and Tumen expressed a strong insistence on this topic. The Knight of Fanzan even threatened to withdraw from the meeting, and only then did he reluctantly let the undead's envoys join the meeting. However, the situation was still not optimistic. The Wind Elves in the meeting gave the undead of Madara a cold shoulder, and the meeting fell into an endless stalemate. Vala and the old Prime Minister served as the liaison between the three sides, but when they privately asked the people of Fanzan, the latter only said that it was Lady Martha's instructions. The people of Fanzan believed in the path of light, which directly originated from the gods of the previous era. It was said that they could connect with Martha and get some oracles, but the old Prime Minister and Vala were more willing to believe that it was just a hint from Sage Uranta. As for the people of Saint Tassol, their intentions were even more unyielding. The Wind Elves even directly said that they could win the war without the undead's participation, and they also privately questioned the undead's intentions, suspecting that Madara had actually colluded with the Twilight Dragon. From a personal point of view, both the old Prime Minister and Vala thought that Fanzan's actions were superfluous. But they had to listen to Tumen's opinion, because they knew who really controlled this powerful fortress. Without this fortress, it would be impossible for them to stop the Crystal's army here. The people of Cruzes reclaimed their country. But this troublesome matter finally ushered in a turnaround half a month later. Time turned into the second half of November, and the wilderness of the Four Realms ushered in the first snowfall of the winter of the Year of the Sword. When the mountains of Algash began to be covered with white snow, the silver folk of Wonde, the Bugis, finally arrived at the fortress. Since the upheaval in the net of law of Tiamat, and the collapse of the silver folk city in the sky, the silver folk had fallen into their own troubles. Although the silver folk led by Solomon still participated in the Battle of Cruz and fought side by side with the dragons in the war, but after that, the news of the Silver Alliance was blocked, and the silver folk no longer appeared on the earth. It was not until 3 months later that Solomon sent another envoy to inform the people of Cruz and Fanzan that the Silver Alliance would participate in this meeting. And now, they were here. Due to the position of the Bugis floating empire on the Sea of Eternal Darkness, they formed a natural barrier between the Wind Elves and Madara. Although the Bugis claimed to be indifferent to worldly affairs, the wizards and the elves had a deeper friendship in private. The magic armor of the elves of Saint Tassol, the floating fleet, were all in the shadow of the Bugis. In the war to support Erwin, the Bugis were actually on the side of the elves. The Silver Folk even occasionally helped the elves to punish the undead of Madara, and set up a number of monitoring stations on the border of Madara to warn the elves of Saint Tassol. Therefore, the elves had always been the natural allies of the Bugis. After receiving the assurance of these silver-robed wizards, the Wind Elves were relaxed for the first time, and finally agreed to let the undead send an army led by Her Majesty the Queen to the fortress to participate in the battle. However, they still insisted on their own opinion of the undead's request for territory and refuge in the east of Saint Tassol. They did not agree. But everyone understood the meaning behind this disagreement. As long as the undead's performance in this war was recognized by the world of light, then the follow-up issues were not impossible to negotiate. The old Prime Minister Nydivan knew that the long-famous Queen of the Undead was a real politician, and she would definitely agree to this request. The process of the meeting began to move forward gradually with the elves' agreement. A week later, the Second Elven Army was stationed in the fortress. Soon, the countries in the Silver Bay area also mobilized their own troops and began to move north. At this time, there was good news in the countries under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The long-missing nun princess had returned to her homeland of Antiburo and responded to the call of the Cruz people and the Holy Cathedral of Fire to recruit volunteers in her homeland to go to the front line to support the war. Under the great influence of this princess, the countries in the east of the Silver Bay quickly established a real coalition army and began to march north in the name of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. At the beginning of December, the old head of the Armand family, the grandfather of Nun Princess Magadol, and one of the 12 deputy marshals of the coalition army in the last Holy War, the White Wolf Blade Master Blanc, reappeared in the Antiburo Duchy, causing a sensation in the Silver Bay and even the Holy Cathedral of Fire. The former deputy marshal of the coalition army was said to have been missing for nearly 50 years, and almost everyone who knew him thought that he had passed away. But unexpectedly, this legendary hero reappeared at the most critical moment of the world. The Antiburo Duchy was said to be rejoicing because of this, and the Cruz people, under the instructions of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, re-granted the title of Deputy Marshal to the old hero, and handed over the command of the coalition army in the east of the Silver Bay area to him. At the same time, another thing happened that made the old Imperial Chancellor, Nydivan, who was still in the Alcash area, both excited and nervous. It was said that someone had found traces of his granddaughter, Delphian, in the Silver Bay area. After sending a letter to Princess Magadol and receiving confirmation, the old man, who was nearing the end of his life, was so excited that he almost burst into tears. Everything seemed to be moving in a good direction at the end of this year's winter, except for the shadows that were growing in the corners of the world. But it was at this time that the meeting in the wilderness of the Four Territories once again came to a halt. The reason was simple. The Bugis suddenly left the meeting. On the 17th of December, the Bugis delegation suddenly announced to all parties that they would temporarily withdraw from the meeting, and may return at an unknown time. But nothing was certain. As for the reason, the Silver Folk, as arrogant as they were before, did not mention it. But the next day, almost all the silver-robed mages who stayed in Babel Fortress disappeared. Before this incident caused a stir in the entire meeting, another person who returned to Babel Fortress brought more important news. A carriage drove into Kingston Fort. The carriage was heavily guarded, with nearly 30 Kurlut's heavy cavalry surrounding the two four-wheeled carriages. Before the carriage came to a stop, a servant ran to the door, opened it, and put down a low stool to let the passengers in the carriage alight. The environment around Kingston Fort was naturally far inferior to the imperial capital, and these fortresses located in the mountains were only connected by potholed roads. Although it was enough to support the mobility of small-scale cavalry, it was barely enough for a carriage. But the passenger in the carriage did not seem to care too much about this. She leaned half of her body out, looked around, and then said coldly, "Take me to see my father." When he received the news of his daughter's arrival, Nedwin Jr. was discussing with his father, the Prime Minister Nedwin Sr. about the meaning behind the strange departure of the Bugis. But when the door was pushed open, the two saw their daughter, who had obviously lost a lot of weight, waved her hand to let the servant leave the room first, then closed the door behind her, and said to the two with a serious face. "Father, grandfather, please seal off the entire Babel fortress immediately." The Bugis suddenly left because something big happened in the White Mountain area. Vahina. "Ah, I'm so sorry, Shido, I was distracted." Vahina frowned as she looked in the direction of the elven delegation. She had just seen a messenger rushing in the direction of the delegation, and connected it to the strange atmosphere in the meeting in recent days. She had a vague feeling that something big had happened. The scholar lady adjusted her glasses and only smiled slightly. "It's nothing, but we have to speed up a little. Later, Lord Veronica and Lord Mangrove will use this sandbox, we have to set it up before then." Yes, Miss Lorena, the #1 genius girl of Rushta, who had become the deputy commander of the Imperial Temple Knight Regiment at a young age, covered her mouth and yawned. How annoying. In yesterday's battle, those annoying tree spikes lost a few fortresses in the Greystone Valley, but today, we crews have to help them get them back. Ah, I'm so sleepy. Lorena, the young lady's fiancé, Philas, hurriedly tugged at her sleeve. "Don't let the old Prime Minister and Lord Vala hear you say that. This time, both of us will have to be grounded for a week." Lorena did not seem to care. "That's true. I really hate hanging out with these politicians all day. I heard that Ka and Nasha have joined the frontline combat forces with Lord Veronica's permission. Damn it, I'm so envious. You're a girl, what's so good about fighting and killing?" Philas disagreed. "Useless." Lorena glared at the guy. "Look at Mr. Brando, he's already a count at such a young age, and he's still just from Erewhon. I'm a count too. What's there to be proud of as a hereditary count? Can you defeat Her Majesty the Queen? Can you defeat the Empire?" Well, Philas hurriedly shook his head. "Even if I had the ability, I wouldn't dare. Besides, you don't have the ability." Lorena shook her head and sighed at her fiancé. She suddenly thought of something and looked at Vahina. "By the way, Vahina, I heard that you seem to have known Count Tonagel for a long time." "Ah." Only then did Vahina come to her senses and hurriedly shook her head. "Ah, well, we just know each other." She suddenly remembered her first meeting with Brando, and although she denied it, she could not help but blush. "You're blushing, Vahina." Lorena seemed to have discovered a new continent. "No way, don't tell me you're interested in that count." "No, of course not." Vahina hurriedly denied it loudly. "What are you talking about? I've only met Brando twice." "Oh, Brando." Rushdie's genius lady giggled. "You've only met him twice, and you're already so familiar with him." "Lorena." Vahina called out halfway, but the second half of her sentence was suddenly stuck in her throat. Her blue eyes revealed an incredulous light as she said in surprise, Miss Delphian." Pfft, Lorena laughed. "Vahina, your excuse for changing the topic is a little too clumsy. Miss Delphian. You might as well say Miss Veronica to make me more scared." Vahina's expression was extremely strange. "No, Lorena, it's true. It's true, don't joke around. That hateful woman has long disappeared, and now I'm the #1 genius of Rushta." But Lorena suddenly froze. Because a hand was gently placed on her shoulder. "Dear little sister Lorena, so I'm such an annoying woman in your heart." The Prime Minister's daughter smiled slightly. The #1 genius of Rushta." Faraz saw his fiancé's face turn pale. She stammered, Miss Delphian, I'll deal with you later." Delphian glared at her and turned to Vahina. "Vahina, I'm here for you." "Miss Delphian, you're back." Delphian nodded. "Do you know who I met?" "Who?" "Brando." "Ha." Vahina was shocked and almost had the illusion that she was seen through. She looked around in fear and asked in a small voice, "What's wrong?" But Delphine's expression was very serious. "I need your help now, Vahina." Chapter 1442. The two sisters, Ling and Lotus, were sitting on chairs, using wooden knives and forks to focus on the barbecued meat and bread in front of them. The two sisters had a very cute white milk mark on their lips, and the cup of milk was placed to the side. Slomer was a relatively large town near the Buchi region. This town on the border of the Black Forest gathered a large number of adventurers and merchants who did business in the Black Forest. It was one of the largest settlements and markets outside the borders of Madara and Erewhon. Of course, this place was usually a lawless area. The owner of the town was a mercenary group, and as long as it was not a battle on the surface, all kinds of conspiracies and tricks were allowed. Of course, these little tricks were not in Brando's eyes. After secretly dealing with 3 blind thieves who tried to attack Ling and Lotus, as well as 2 thieves who tried to steal his wallet, they settled down in this inn. Of course, the two sisters knew nothing about this. This place was very close to the loop of trade winds in Buchi. To its north was the southern foot of the Tosankade Forest, the Silman River Valley, and to its west was the gentle slope of the Greyhar Mountains. Brando remembered that before summer came, he had once brought Freya into the Greyhar Mountains. At that time, when he looked east from the cliff, he saw the dusky forest in front of his eyes. In fact, the forest they were in now was called the Summerfield Forest. This forest was the easternmost part of the Black Forest in the loop of trade winds. Further east was the Buchi Mountains that connected with Madara, which was also the place they had passed through before. This forest could be said to be a part of the Black Forest, but it could also be said to be the periphery of the Black Forest. In these places where there were few people, there were often opportunities that ordinary people could not imagine. In the forest, there were magical beasts, mineral deposits, and treasures left behind by the predecessors. These could all represent a windfall. Because of this reason, this place gradually became the gathering place of the southern Erewhon adventurers and desperados. Brando even knew that the adventurers and mercenaries who gathered in Tonajul would travel to this place in the autumn and summer. Every spring, they would set off from Tonajul and pass through the forest of Tonajul to come here for an adventure, to seek a commission, or just to find something to do. In autumn, before winter, they would leave this place and return to Tonajul for the long winter. But ever since the original overlord of Abes was killed, the order in Tonajul was restored. Apart from a few law-abiding adventurers, the outlaws and mercenaries were chased out of Tonajul. Some of them went to the Silman region, while others went to Chablis. But no matter what, the number of foreigners staying in Tonajul increased. That was why there was such a lively scene. If it was before the Year of the Sword, this town would be relatively deserted and desolate during this season. Mercenaries and adventurers were known as the outlaws in Wonde. They were the poorest people in the world, but at the same time, they were also the most extravagant people. Their money came and went quickly because no one knew when they would lose their lives. That was why they lived in a hurry. Their extravagant spending habits spurred the local businesses, and the merchants who gathered here came from this. But there were also many types of businesses, and there were many women who were involved in the prostitution business. Just opposite this inn, Brando saw a few scantily dressed prostitutes trying to attract customers. Most of their customers were not particular people, and some of them even openly flirted with each other on the streets. When Brendel saw a guy impatiently putting his hand under one of the women's clothes, he finally could not help but frown and got up to close the window. Then, Brando threw the guy who threatened him to open the window out of the hall to the street outside. After that, he clapped his hands and sat down again. He saw that the two sisters' faces were a little red. Ling's face was a little calmer, and Lotus' face was like a ripe apple. "Don't mind those people. They're just a bunch of scum." "Yes, Mr. Brando." The little girl stuttered. Eat more, you have to finish the milk. Seeing the two sisters' expressions of disgust, Brando couldn't help but smile. The barbecue sauce here is the specialty. You won't be able to taste something as authentic as this if you head north of Chablis. The ingredients in the dark forest are very rare in the outside world. You'll have to go to Trondheim for your next meal, and you'll have to eat jerky on the way. Lotus couldn't help but stick out her tongue when she heard that. The jerky on the road was dry and salty, like firewood in a salt pot. Of course, it also looked like that on the surface. But no matter what, it was much better than the two sisters going hungry. At least they didn't have to worry about being with this lord. It was a pity that her sister insisted on returning to Lantern Island, and she also wanted to go back to the monastery and see her companions. Otherwise, it would be better to stay in Tonajol. In addition to the mouth-watering roast venison, there was also a curved croissant, which was also a local specialty. It was seasoned with several berries from the dark forest, and it was deeply loved by the two sisters. Even the usually quiet Ling showed a satisfied look after taking a bite. After the meal, Brendel ordered fruits for the two sisters as dessert. A wooden tray filled with grapes and wild strawberries was served, but these fruits were the most expensive part of the meal. The grapes grown in the lowland manors along the coast of Lantern Island had to be stored in a magic cellar before they could be transported over long distances. The merchants had to put a partition in the wooden box, layer after layer of straw, then put in the magically preserved grapes, layer after layer of straw, and finally nail a wooden board. It would take hundreds of miles for them to arrive here. The grapes that could be found everywhere in the lowlands of Lantern Island were more expensive than gold here. Lotus had a good memory, so she could vaguely guess the value of these precious fruits. She couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The pair of sisters, who had always lived a poor life, felt a sense of guilt after eating so much gold in one meal. However, Brando didn't care about it. From Nauvoo to Bodo and then to Marlow, the three of them ate and slept in the open along the way. Although it didn't matter what he ate with his current strength, the two little girls were still in the growing stage. In human age, they were at most 11 years old. It was the time when they needed to replenish their nutrition. There was no such condition in the wilderness, and it was not easy to find a place to settle down. Naturally, they had to be rewarded. The two sisters were the children of Bai, but they were also Medish's relatives. These two lovely and strong little girls, in Brando's opinion, should have been born to enjoy the life of a princess, but reality made them struggle in a difficult situation. Even so, they did not give up hope. Instead, they embarked on the road to find their mother without hesitation. From Lantern Island to Madara, the journey of thousands of miles, not only did they protect themselves well, but they also learned along the way. Just this perseverance alone was hard not to like. Moreover, this amount of money was actually nothing to Brando. Not to mention the huge wealth of Valhalla and Abes that belonged to him, even Count Randner's annuity was not enough for him to use up. The only thing that surprised Brando was that these fresh magic cellar grapes were more expensive than the annual red wine of the local manor outside of Lantern Island. They were precious ingredients that could only be seen on the tables of nobles. He did not expect to see such things in this small town by the border. This was not just a factor of their value and price. This also involved the spending power of the land. Brando could not help but be curious. Could it be that in the 2 years he was in Tonajol, Marlow, this small town, had become so prosperous that even small inns were ready to receive noble guests at any time? However, Brando's question was quickly answered. A young man holding a wine glass appeared in front of him. The other party was wearing a silk robe and the emblem on his mink fur hat, all of which indicated that he was a noble. However, Brando noticed that the other party's behavior was slightly inappropriate. Although he was not a proper noble himself, he had been around the best nobles in the kingdom, such as the princess, Oberway, and Maynard, and finally cultivated to a level where he had not eaten pork before. Just by observation alone, he was able to distinguish whether a noble had a background or not. even though I don't think it's that useful. He guessed that this young man might be a descendant of one of the new noble families in Erewhon. Since the war between Ampere Seal and Ranner, the structure of the nobles in the kingdom had changed greatly. Those who were persecuted in the Frost Rebellion had been rehabilitated. Although some of them may not have originally been members of the royal faction, because there were too many vacancies in the two wars, and after the war, Her Royal Highness had reinfeft a group of nobles who had performed meritorious deeds. New nobles had sprung up like bamboo shoots after the rain. The typical characteristic of these new nobles was that they did not have a fief, or a small fief with no real power, but they were often close to the royal family or the princess, or held real power. Although Erewhon did not have a ruling body that could be called a government or a court, but under his influence, a bureaucratic system around Princess Griffin and Heruz was gradually forming. These people would form a new political ecology in Erewhon in the future. They would no longer be vassals, but ministers of the king and the kingdom. Chapter 1443. Due to the lack of land, these new nobles had no common interests with the traditional nobles. In fact, since the new nobles were closely tied to the royal family for good or ill, at least for now, they were almost naturally opposed to the traditional nobles. However, Erewhon's new nobles were not yet a force to be reckoned with, but one day, they would become a force that Her Highness could rely on. Brando's guess was right. The young man in front of him was called Hain, and his father was an attendant of the royal family. In the past, this position was insignificant in Erewhon's aristocratic ecosystem, but now it held real power. It was said that Her Highness intended to imitate the system after the reform of the Cruz Empire and re-establish the position of Prime Minister. Although Hain did not expect his father to become the Prime Minister of the kingdom, the prosperity of the bureaucratic system meant that his father could reach a higher position in the system in the future. At least, he would not be a nameless attendant of the royal family for the rest of his life. And with the gradual rise of the royal faction, his father's status also rose. Although his official position was still the same, Hain's father had won the trust of Oberway. The latter was almost the prime minister of the empire, but he had not been crowned with that title yet. His family's status also rose by leaps and bounds. Originally, he was just a small nobleman, but now he was developing in the direction of a big family. His 8-year-old brother was also sent to Trenheim to learn and grow up in the territory of the famous count, and the family had high hopes for him. Hain himself was not ambitious, so he was not jealous of this. His current noble title might not be hereditary in the future, and he only liked to make friends with nobles. Besides, he was happy to see his family's status rise. Hain had long noticed Brando in the inn. Although the young man did not look like a noble, he had a natural aura that was hard to ignore and even unforgettable. Hain did not know that it was because of Brando's soul and habits as a modern person. Ever since he stepped into the realm of the sage, the aura he exuded was more natural and natural. Just like a sage like Eloranta, no matter how plainly dressed or how ordinary her appearance was, she would still be noticed in a crowd. Unless the latter deliberately hid it, the majestic aura was as obvious as the bright moon in the night sky. But this alone was not enough for Hain to meet Brando in person. The fruits were just a gesture of goodwill, and he did not want to let Brando know of his existence. But after seeing Brando teach the drunkard a lesson, Hain finally could not help but stand up. "Hello, are these two lovely ladies yours, Your Excellency?" "They are my sisters." Hainfu revealed a look of realization. In fact, he didn't care about Lien and Ling's identity. It was just an excuse. Although the two elves did make him a little curious, it was just curiosity. Ling and Lien looked at Brendel with slight surprise. They probably did not expect him to say that. "Did you pass by Moloth?" Brando nodded and looked at this guy with some curiosity. Along the way, there were many people who struck up a conversation with him, but most of them did not have good intentions. They were either tempted by money or had bad intentions towards the half-elven sisters beside him. But the young man in front of him did not look like he was short of money, and did not seem to have bad intentions. He took the initiative to raise his glass, which meant to thank the other party for his hospitality. Obviously, the fruits in the magic cellar came from the young man in front of him. "Me too," Hain replied. "It seems that you are from Erewhon." "I am Hain of the Montolo family, and my father is Derek Montolo." "Derek Montolo." "Sophie." "Sophie." Hain was stunned. It did not sound like a noble's name, and the other party did not report his family background. He knew that he might be a little abrupt, but fortunately, he did not care. "It seems that Mr. Sophie has just fled from Madara." "How did you know that I fled back?" Brando could not help but laugh as he motioned for the other party to sit down. Hain did not refuse. He sat down and asked, "Mr. Sophie, is the situation in Madara good? Is the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon really as bad as the rumors say?" Brando was still a little puzzled. There were not many people in Erewhon who were interested in Madara. Although the two countries were so close, and Erewhon had been suffering from the flames of war in Madara for a long time, the strange phenomenon was that almost no one in this kingdom, from the nobles to the commoners, really studied their neighbor. Even some of the rumors among the commoners were mostly false bedtime stories that were full of descriptions of the green-faced, fanged undead of Madara. However, there were very few people who really knew the ins and outs of the Dark Kingdom. He wondered if the rumors of the 47-foot in Madara had spread to Erewhon so quickly. The speed of the rumors was really fast. It had only been 2 or 3 months since the battle in Mihodafen, and that was something that happened in the south of the Sea of the Dying Moon. While thinking, he shook his head and said, "My sisters and I came from the vicinity of Erewhon." It was indeed crowded with refugees. Most of them wanted to escape across the sea to the Silver Bay area or the White Mountains. There were very few people who really went to Erewhon like us. I chose to go by land, but the mountain paths near Karsuk were almost all sealed, so we had to go around the south of Daubwa and enter Erewhon through the northern edge of the Black Forest of Kalanga. Brando described his journey along the way, but the reason he went around Daubwa was not because the mountain paths in Karsuk were sealed off by the Highland Knight, but because it was closer to Tonajol. But this explanation sounded reasonable to Hainf. He could imagine how difficult and dangerous this journey was. From Daubwa to Malos, there were mountains and precipitous ridges. The journey was no less than 1,000 miles, and there were almost no civilized areas along the way. This young man and his sisters were lucky to be able to reach here, and also showed that the other party's strength was indeed not ordinary. Hearing this, he could not help but sigh, "Then you're really lucky." "Oh, why?" "Now it seems that you made the right choice not to go to the White Mountains and Silver Bay like the others." Hainf lowered his voice, "I'm afraid Mr. Sophie still doesn't know that something happened in the White Mountains." "What happened?" Brando frowned. He had heard some rumors along the way, but because he had been hurrying along the edge of civilization, he had no time to pay attention to other things. In addition, these rumors were now widely spread in the north of Madara. Some of them were obviously nonsense, but they still had a large audience. The army that the elves allowed the undead to enter suddenly attacked the White Mountains and killed the king of the mountains, Shalafang. It is said that thousands of local residents were killed, most of them elves of Alisan. The elven court of Saint Tossol was furious because of this, and now the elves have sealed their borders. It is said that they are going to war with the undead of Madara. "That's impossible," Brando said firmly. "The undead in the White Mountains now must be the main force of the Roman Black Rose led by the Queen of Madara. This undead army was waiting for the results of the conference to decide whether to stay or leave. How could they suddenly attack the Wind Elves at this time? Unless something happened during the conference, but that was still impossible." In his impression, the Queen of Madara was definitely not such an impulsive person. His reaction scared Hainf. "This is indeed unbelievable, but the news is very true. It has already spread in Erewhon. It is said that the Wind Elves did not allow Madara to settle in the wilderness to the east of their kingdom. Brando shook his head. This was too ridiculous. The Queen of Madara would never suddenly attack because of this. However, if the rumors were true, then things had become complicated. The undead had killed the Mountain King, Shalafang. This hero of the White Mountains was still alive in the original history of the Second Age. He was extremely prestigious among the elves, and he was also a member of the Elven court. If he really died at the hands of the undead, then the hatred between Saint Tassol and Madara would never be quelled. He frowned, faintly feeling that things were a little beyond his expectations. He suddenly felt a sense of urgency to return to Erewhon as soon as possible. The change in this matter might be far from as simple as it seemed. He instinctively felt that there might be the shadow of the Twilight Dragon behind this. If that was the case, Erewhon might also be in danger. Brando did not forget that Lady Martha had told him before she left that the Throne of Destiny was in that blessed land. He knew very well what the Twilight Dragon's true purpose was. He was not worried about anything else, but if the Twilight Dragon used the same method to assassinate Her Highness or anyone around him, it would be a loss he could not bear. The sudden gloominess of the young man in front of him made Hank feel that the topic was a little difficult to continue. In fact, he even felt as if he was suffocating. What's going on? Hank was horrified. Why did this young man just frown make him feel as if the sky outside had darkened? Even in front of his stern father, he had never experienced such a feeling. He subconsciously sat up straight, his palms sweating. He was trying to find a topic to end this terrible conversation, but his mind seemed to be blank. For a moment, his smooth negotiation ability seemed to have become dry, and he even forgot what he wanted to say. Chapter 1444. Ling and Lotus naturally noticed the change in Brando, but the two sisters had been with Brando for a long time and were already used to his aura, so they didn't feel too uncomfortable. However, they were also surprised. They faintly felt that ever since they returned from the stagnation realm, Brando's aura was getting stronger by the day. Sometimes, when he inadvertently revealed it, it was as if the whole world would change color. His aura was like a true king patrolling his kingdom. It was as if he was a god on earth, so out of place with the mortals around him. At this moment, the light in the inn dimmed, and a group of people walked in from outside. Henf subconsciously raised his head, and when he saw the people walking in from outside, his face couldn't help but change color. Henf, you coward, you're actually hiding here. There were a total of 5 people coming in from outside. Other than the 4 wizards in long robes, there was also an arrogant young man. The latter was also dressed in noble clothing, and his every move showed his nobility. When the young man saw this direction, a trace of surprise flashed in his eyes, and then he said sarcastically, "Do you really think I'll find trouble with you? You think too highly of yourself. Even if it's your younger brother, I wouldn't care, let alone a piece of trash like you. But you're lucky that you hid fast enough. Otherwise, I would have beaten you up." He still wanted to say something, but as if he was afraid of the wizards behind him, he shook his head in disdain and walked into the inn. Brando came back to his senses and looked in that direction, but he just happened to see the young man looking at him provocatively. He had already experienced the frivolity of these young nobles, so he didn't take it to heart. He only turned around and asked Henf, "These people are?" "That's Roant, the son of the Count of Redbud. His father is a retainer of the Grand Duke of Grimoires, and he himself is a famous genius in grimoires. It is said that he has the potential to become a genius of the new generation of Erewhon after the Valkyrie, the Sword of the White Lion, Breton, and Loka. But he is indeed very strong, even my younger brother can't compare to him." Henf answered truthfully. At the end of his sentence, he could not help but look at Brendel with lingering fear. The scene from before was deeply engraved in his memory. He really could not imagine how strong this young man in front of him was, to be able to make him feel that way with just a change in his emotions. Maybe this is a master who has stepped into the gold realm. Such a young gold realm, Henf was secretly shocked. He knew that the so-called three geniuses of Erewhon, the Valkyrie Freya, the Sword of the White Lion, Breton, and the young Vice-Commander Loka, had only just touched the elemental realm. In other words, this young man in front of him might have the talent that was not inferior to the most outstanding geniuses of Erewhon. Realizing this, Henf couldn't help but subconsciously put Brando on the same level as himself, or even higher. Roant. Brando frowned, thinking that he had never heard of this name before he left Erewhon. However, he had left Erewhon for a long time, more than half a year. During this time, many things had happened in and out of Erewhon, and some things were indeed very different from before he left. He thought for a moment and asked, "Speaking of the geniuses of Grimoires, have you heard of a person called Finis?" "Mr. Finis," Henf said with deep respect, "are you talking about the young man who shone in the swordsmanship tournament in Count Randner? I heard that he had received guidance from the Count. Mr. Finis' swordsmanship is now second to none among the young geniuses of Erewhon, and Roant is far from being his match. However, I heard that Mr. Finis went to St. Tossol to learn swordsmanship in the Wind Elven Empire." Brando did not expect Petit Finis to have such a situation. It seemed that he was not wrong about the latter's talent, but it was a pity that they were not on the same path. Otherwise, he would not have minded accepting Petit Finis as his student. The reason he gave Petit Finis pointers in swordsmanship was to open a door to a wider world for him. Now, it seemed that the starting point had served its purpose. Petit Finis going to St. Tossol could be said to be both unexpected and expected. Perhaps one day, another sword saint would be born in Erewhon, but only those who walked on this path would understand the hardships of this path. He believed that Petit Finis would be able to overcome all of this. Since Petit Finis was far superior to that guy called Roant, then it seemed that he was not a great genius. Brando no longer cared about the hurried glance he gave him. "Mr. Henf, who is your brother?" "My brother is my father's youngest son. He is only 8 years old this year. Unlike my useless elder brother, he has some talent in swordsmanship, and the family thinks highly of him." Henf smiled at the mention of his brother. "My father sent him to Tonajol to learn under the Count. Although we do not expect him to become the Count's attendant knight, as long as he can learn something, it will be enough for him to use for the rest of his life." When Henf mentioned the Count, his tone was full of reverence. No matter how much Brando was criticized by the traditional nobles, it could not change his legendary experience of turning the tide in the Battle of Ampere Seal. Now, Brando had long been the idol of almost all the teenagers and young people in Erewhon. He was the dream lover in the hearts of countless girls, especially to the rising nobles. This Count not only represented a legend, but also a rising political power. As a child of a rising noble family, this kind of influence was often double. Henf could not help but say, "Speaking of which, the Count is the real genius of Erewhon. I heard that he is not even 40 years old this year, but he is already a sword saint with the strength of elemental activation. At the same time, he is also the Count of the Kingdom, the hero who saved the royal family and Her Highness the Princess. Compared to this Count, what is Roant? Not even 40 years old." Brando almost spat out his rice. He wondered how he had suddenly aged 20 years. However, he also understood that his actions were too unusual. Most people would find it hard to believe that he had done all this in his early 20s. In fact, he had lived 2 lives, and his mentality was indeed not that of a 20-year-old boy. Moreover, in this world, there were only a few people like Eek who had become a duke at such a young age. Moreover, the Ophelia family had its own difficulties. Hearing Henf's boasting, the 2 sisters, Ling and Lien, could not help but laugh. The elder sister was a little more reserved, only slightly pursing her lips, but the younger sister kept looking straight at Brando, as if there was a flower on his face. Fortunately, Heinf was immersed in recalling the heroic deeds of the Count and did not notice the abnormalities of the two elven sisters. Brando could not bear to disturb the young man's fantasy, but he thought of something and asked, "Do you know the wizards who were with the young man?" Heinf obviously couldn't give an answer to this question. "They're probably the guards he hired," he guessed. Brando did not comment, but he could vaguely sense a familiar aura from the four magi. Although he was in a hurry to return to Erewhon, Brando still let the two elven sisters rest for the night at Moloch. The following journey would be deep into the Black Forest to the west of the Kalanga Mountains. It was not at all easier than traversing the mountains of the Yusong Mountains. In fact, it was even more troublesome. Although Moloch was already close to Tonajol, he still had to go around the Greyhar Mountains to reach Abes. If he were alone, he could directly pass through the highest peak of the Greyhar Mountains and save nearly half the journey. However, with the elven sisters, this journey would take at least 2 days. Before the sun set, he tried to summon the Shire and quickly received a response. However, the Shire was not in Erewhon at the moment, but had gone to the Silver Bay area. However, the Shire told him that they would return to Erewhon as soon as possible. If necessary, they could even summon him back to their side. There was no need for that. However, Brando had originally planned to use the Shire to inform Amandina and the Princess of Tonajol that he was on his way back. Now, this wish of his had fallen through. Early the next morning, Heinf came to invite them along as promised. It turned out that after hearing that Brando and the other two were preparing to go to Tonajol, this nobleman had a sudden idea to visit the Count's territory. Firstly, he wanted to see his younger brother, and secondly, he wanted to fulfill his dream of chasing after his idol. However, Brando felt that the latter was the main reason. For this reason, Lotus had been secretly laughing along the way, making fun of this fellow for being as blind as a bat. In this regard, Brando did not mind. Although he did not have much of an impression of this young man, and the latter even gave him the impression that he was a little too pompous, he also wanted to take this opportunity to see the mentality of the new nobles. He wanted to see how their descendants would change the political environment of Erewhon. It had to be said that Heinf was a very talkative person. As they passed through the bustling market of Marloth, Brando would occasionally take care of the greedy eyes and hands that were reaching for the two sisters. Heinf, on the other hand, introduced them to some of the local history and the rare treasures produced in the dark forest that the merchants were selling. Brando was very knowledgeable, and naturally knew that nearly half of the things that this fellow introduced were full of mistakes. Even so, among the nobles of Erewhon, he could be considered to have a good eye. Some things could only be explained by the locals, but this young man was able to speak logically as if he was a native who had been immersed in this place for many years. In fact, the latter had only stayed here for a little more than a week. This could be considered a skill. The key was that with such a tour guide, the journey became a lot more lively and not so boring, especially for the two sisters. Although Brando knew a lot of things himself, even more than Heinf, he was already used to it. He might not be able to speak so vividly and captivatingly about these things. Time passed quickly, and on the morning of the third day, the group had already entered the Greyhill Mountains. Chapter 1445. The woodlands to the east of the Greyhill Mountains grew along the gentle slopes. The trees were lush like a blanket. The mountainside was shrouded in a thin winter fog. Brando, Hain, Ling, and Lotus walked along the valley. The mountain stream flowed between the pebbles on the riverbank. When they waded across the river, Lotus naughtily lifted her shoes and stuck her bare feet into the cold water. She showed a grimacing expression. Brando looked at the sisters with a smile and lifted them up one by one. Hain was the first to cross the river. After he crossed the river, he screamed in surprise. Brando carried the sisters across the river. Only then did he realize that there was a layer of dense, red carpet on the shoal on the other side of the river. It was dragon blood moss. At this moment, Hayne was standing on the red carpet, looking very surprised. Dragon blood moss was originally an unknown plant in the Black Forest. However, ever since the alchemists in Tonajol began to extract the lesser dragon blood potion from dragon blood moss, the value of this ordinary plant increased 100 times among the adventurers. Moreover, the Roman Seven Seas Merchant Association and the royal family of Erewhon were purchasing dragon blood moss as an alchemy raw material without limit. This trend even affected other countries. They sent spies and envoys to Tonajol to seek the formula of the lesser dragon blood potion and purchase this herb. Because of this, the number of dragon blood moss in the Black Forest in the south of Erewhon, especially at the edge of the Black Forest, was rapidly decreasing. The price of this herb was also rising steadily. In recent months, it was rare to see dragon blood moss of this scale unless one went deep into the Black Forest. However, the order and law in the Black Forest were different from other places. It was common for the scenery on the same path to change on a large scale. Some places could even become a forest in a day. It was not strange for dragon blood moss to grow densely all of a sudden. It was nothing more than a manifestation of a change in the law of a certain place. Mr. Sophie. Haynes turned around and waved his hand excitedly. We've made a small fortune. There's so much dragon's blood moss here. There are 4 of us, 3 of you and 1 of me. How about we divide it? Brando nodded and couldn't help but look at this noble child in a new light. Wealth and silk moved people's hearts. Although some noble children had a much more indifferent attitude towards money and goods, Hanf was able to take Ling and Lien into consideration when dividing the wealth. At least this showed that the other party was a meticulous and sensible person. What are these plants? Lotus was a little surprised to see Hanf's unusual excitement. She squatted down and stroked the dragon blood moss with her hand. She only felt that it was no different from ordinary lichens. Before they left Erewhon, the role of dragon blood moss was far from being taken seriously, so they had no idea of the value of this plant. This is dragon blood moss, ladies, Hanf replied loudly. This is a lot of money. Ever since the Count invented the dragon blood potion, the value of this plant has multiplied 100 times. Now, it can be sold for hundreds of tor per ounce on the black market. The 2 sisters' eyes once again converged on Brando, and Ling was no exception. In the past 2 days, they had heard too much about the Count from Hanf, and these were things that Brando did not talk about. So much. I'm afraid there's at least 100 pounds here. Not that much. It still needs to be dried. It's good enough if there's even a 10th left. Hanf shook his head. Brando did not expect the value of dragon blood moss to rise so quickly, but it made sense after thinking about it. In the past, the value of this herb was not high in the game because it was produced in large quantities. Because players could go deep into the Black Forest, dragon blood moss was not a rare thing in those places. Mr. Brando, Lotus whispered to him, my sister and I can't accept such a precious thing. You didn't discuss this proposal with your sister, did you? Brando looked at Ling, who was holding his sister's wrist tightly. Lotus's face turned red, and Ling also blushed, but the little girl immediately turned her head with a sour face. Brando touched Lotus's head and said, these dragon blood moss are nothing to me, but it's very important to you. I'll ask Hanf to convert it into money. In the future, when you live in Lantern Island, although I can ask my friends there to take care of you, you still need to have money in your hands. We can earn it ourselves, Mr. Brando. You can't live on this money for the rest of your life. The lifespan of elves is much longer than that of humans. Brando teased them, but with this money, you can buy a shop. With a stable source of income, you can settle down and inquire about your mother. Lotus did not object. Brando said again, when we return to Tonajol, I'll help you and your sister get a bottle of dragon blood potion. This potion is actually more effective when used when you're underage. Mr. Brando. Lotus's eyes could not help but turn red. "Why are you so good to us?" Brando touched her head and did not answer. It was actually more beneficial for Hainf to convert the dragon blood moss into cash. After all, the price of this item in the south of Erewhon was increasing day by day, let alone in the north. However, Brando did not care too much about the dragon blood moss. The White Lion Guards in Valhalla had already fully popularized the dragon blood potion. Erewhon's current demand for dragon blood came from the White Lion Legion in the north and Yanalasu's Royal Navy, followed by the local legions. There was not much difference whether these potions fell into his hands or Hainf's hands. In the end, they would all flow into Erewhon's dragon blood moss market. He was more concerned about the meaning behind the sudden appearance of the dragon blood moss. Dragon blood moss rarely grew on such a large scale at the edge of the Black Forest. This was because at the border of Martha's blessed land, the laws of the area were relatively stable. A large-scale phenomenon often meant the appearance of a powerful treasure. And the only things that could accelerate the growth of the dragon blood moss were the spring of life and the dragon blood pool. The latter was more or less the same as the former. Brando was slightly tempted. He had always entrusted people to find the whereabouts of the Spring of Life and the Spring of Youth in the Black Forest, but he had missed out on the dragon blood pool. It was not that he was negligent, but this thing was even rarer. Legend had it that the dragon blood pool was formed by the blood of the Dragon King on the ground. It was an unparalleled treasure. The dragon blood in the dragon blood pool could be used to make the best dragon blood potion. This potion could even allow mortals to possess part of the Golden Bloodline's abilities. And this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that the dragon blood pool had an ability similar to the Spring of Life. It could allow people to break out of their cocoons and be reborn. And this function was one of the things that he needed the most. There were too many people around him who needed the Spring of Life. No matter if it was to cure Dilfari's hidden illness, to reconstruct his senior sister's body, or to help the dear Demonis in Kelsey's tomb get rid of her crystallization disease. And with the dragon blood in the dragon blood pool, he could also try to raise Freya to the elemental realm in one fell swoop. With the foundation of bathing in dragon blood, the future Valkyrie would go further on this path, even far surpassing her achievements in the other world. After Hainf finished collecting the dragon blood moss, he left the river bank and went deep into the forest. The scene along the way confirmed Brando's guess. There were patches of magic rhododendrons growing in the forest. This was a typical magical plant. They fed on magic and tended to concentrate in areas where magic was highly active. Hainf was overjoyed. Magic rhododendrons were a relatively common material, but there were so many of them in such high quality, it was rare in the world. He subconsciously consulted Brando, but this time Brando stopped him and chose another direction. "Mr. Sophie, what is this?" Hainf was a little puzzled. But he was a noble after all. He immediately reacted and said with some surprise, "Could it be that there is a gathering point of magic in the forest?" Brando nodded. The magic in the Black Forest would not gather for no reason. It often formed the nest of a natural thing, but there would only be dark magic gathering near the nest. The environment was gloomy and terrifying. In this situation, there must be a natural thing being produced. The so-called natural things were the three major springs of the Spring of Song, the Spring of Life, and the Spring of Youth, the Dragon Blood Pool, as well as the living gold and the golden sheep. But among these natural things, the dragon blood pool was undoubtedly the highest level. What could it be? Hainf asked with some excitement. No matter what kind of natural thing it was the top treasure in the world. But relatively speaking, the Spring of Song and the golden sheep were more common. Adventurers in the Southern Territory often encountered these two things. Among them, the Spring of Song could not be taken away, but it would give eternal luck to those who encountered it. And the spring water was full of silver. Just by taking away the silver, one could make a fortune. But Haynes faintly felt that they might encounter a big thing this time. "Have you heard of the Dragon Blood Pool?" Brando asked. Haynes' face was blank. "Then, have you heard of the Spring of Life?" "WH. What, Mr. Sophie? You mean?" When the noble heard the words, "Spring of Life," his eyes suddenly widened, and even his voice could not help but go out of tune. Brando nodded. Haynes' expression was strange. Sometimes he was excited, sometimes he frowned, but after a while, he fell silent. The Spring of Life had always been one of the most famous legends in the southern territory of Erewhon. Someone once said that there was a Spring of Life in the southern territory of Erewhon, to be exact, in the Tosancade forest. Those who encountered it could rejuvenate and have a long lifespan like the elves. Chapter 1446. Countless people were fascinated by this legend, but countless adventurers lost their lives in the forest south of Chablis. Every year, there would be people claiming to have seen the Fountain of Life, but most of the time, these rumors were proven to be false. Over time, the legend of the Fountain of Life became a legend in the southern region of Erewhon. Brando knew that there was indeed a Fountain of Life in the southern region of Erewhon, but it was not in the Tosancade forest, but in the Black Forest further south. He had been looking for the Fountain of Life, but its whereabouts were uncertain. It did not stay in one place forever, and it was hard to find it. It was normal for him to lose his composure in the face of such a legendary item. Brando was not surprised by his reaction. "Don't worry. If we're lucky enough to see the Fountain of Life, everyone will be able to benefit from it." Hearing Brando's words, Hank finally calmed down. "Don't worry about me, Mr. Sophie. I'll be satisfied if I can see the Fountain of Life from afar." This was not an exaggeration. The Fountain of Life was not an inanimate object. If it did not like something, it would choose to avoid it. But this time, it might not be the Fountain of Life that they saw. The forest suddenly opened up in front of him, and a ruined city appeared in front of him. Or more accurately, it was the ruins of a city. Scattered stone foundations and broken wooden structures were buried between the vines and weeds, but he could still vaguely see the old crisscrossing roads, showing the scene before the passage of time. "This is the lost city," Haynes blurted out. It was said that the slaves in the mines south of the Tosancade forest had fled here after a riot. As time passed, it gradually became a city. It was only when the Southern Legion attacked this place that the local refugees gave up on the city and fled south into the depths of the Black Forest. One of those people built the present-day Malak, and this ruined city was described as a ghost city that disappeared in the forest. For the past 1 or 2 centuries, the legends about it had been shrouded in mystery. But in fact, it had always been there, and adventurers would occasionally pass by. This city was originally called Barb, and Cohen's group had passed by this place when they were on their way to Silman. Later, he mentioned this in a letter to Tonagel, and said that this place was not as strange as it was rumored to be. Brando naturally knew this better than anyone else. He raised his hand to stop Hayne from speaking and said in a low voice, "There are people inside." Adventurers often passed by this city, and it was not strange for someone to set up camp in the ruins, but Brando heard the sounds of fighting. There were people in the ruins, and they were people that Brando recognized. 4 wizards were alternating positions, constantly casting spells behind a broken wall. Their gray cloaks had been taken off, revealing robes covered with silver patterns and runes. They were chanting, and silver beams of light shot out from their ivory staffs, hitting the broken wall and sending dust flying. Angry roars were heard in the smoke, and from time to time, a red shield flashed, as if something was trapped and was in a desperate situation. However, all of a sudden, a huge rock flew out from the smoke and dust. A magus was caught off guard and was hit by the rock. Just as the silver radiance of magic emerged from his body, he was sent flying and crashed into the ruins behind him. The sorcerer quickly crawled out from the dust and rubble. There was a silver sphere of light around him. The power of magic had saved his life, but even so, he was no longer as graceful as before. His ivory staff had been broken into 2 pieces, and the hood on his head had been torn apart. It hung down on both sides, revealing a shiny bald head full of silver tattoos. The wizard raised his head angrily, and on his thin face was a pair of strange silver eyes. There was only the white of his eyes, and there were no pupils. Seeing this scene from afar, Roland walked out from the ruins where he was hiding, looking a little restless. The wizards had made too much noise, and the nearby area was not far from Marlow, so there were often adventurers passing by. He did not expect the lizard to be so difficult to deal with. He was considering whether he should help, but at this moment, a shadow flashed in front of him. Roland saw a person jump over the wall and land in the courtyard where he was hiding. He was shocked and instinctively drew his sword, but when he took a closer look, he realized that it was the useless brother of his classmate in Tonagel. "Heinf, it's you." "Roland." Heinf was also puzzled. He did not expect the person here to be Roland. "Why are you here?" "That's none of your business." Roland saw another person jump over the wall and enter the courtyard. It was the adventurer he saw the other day. He could not help but despise him, thinking that Heinf, this useless fellow, really mixed up with all kinds of people. Then, 2 young ladies jumped down from the wall. Roland looked at them and coldly replied, "Heinf, this is not a place you should be. You'd better get lost. This is also not your territory." Ling also coldly replied, "What right do you have to say that?" Heinf was a little embarrassed. Roland's father's status was much higher than his own, and he was a traditional noble with a fief. Without the support of the princess, he did not dare to offend him. If it was any other time, he would have backed down by now. But for some reason, he looked at Brendel with a gaze that seemed to be at the mercy of the gods. "Because I'm Roland, the son of the Redbud Count." Roland did not care about Heinf at all. He sneered at Ling and said, "Little girl, there are no wise in this world. What a Redbud Count." So the nobles of Erewhon have learned how to bully the weak. Brando's voice calmly sounded, but there are no nobles in a land without a king. Arrogant young people are no different from anyone in this dark forest. Death will always be silent and nameless. Although Heinf looked at Brando, he did not expect the latter to say such bold words. Especially the tone of the first half of the sentence, it almost made people think that he was the king of Erewhon. However, when he thought of the scene in the inn, he felt that it was only natural for a person with such an imposing aura to say something like that. Roland was also astonished, but he quickly reacted. He felt that it was ridiculous that a mere adventurer dared to threaten him. Kill me? With just the 2 of you? Adventurer, you can try. But if you make a move against a noble, you'd better be prepared to bear the consequences. While Heinf was having a headache over the 2 sides not giving in, Brando raised his head and looked into the distance. He felt a strong wave of magic coming from that direction. A moment later, a magus in a silver robe flew over from that direction and landed beside Roland. "What's the matter?" The magus heard Roland's wild laughter and could not help but ask in an unfriendly tone. "There are a few adventurers who entered by mistake." Facing this magus, Roland's arrogance was restrained. He expressionlessly turned around and said to Heinf, "Heinf, for the sake of your brother, I'll give you one last chance. Now scram. Someone you know?" It's my classmate's brother. His father is an attendant of the royal family. He's not a small noble." Roland hesitated for a moment, but still answered truthfully. "The princess's men." The magus frowned. "Then there's no need to go through so much trouble. Just kill them." "Sir Magus, wait." The moment the magus said kill, Heinf reacted and pulled out his sword. However, the magus remained unmoved and raised the ivory staff in his hand. At the same time, Brendel raised his hand as well. He did not seem to make any movements, but the staff flew out of the wizard's hand and landed firmly in his hand. At that moment, everyone was stunned. Except for the sisters Ling and Lien. Heinf, who was holding his sword, froze in place. At this moment, his mind was in a mess. There was only one thought, and that was that the young man he was traveling with was actually a Sir Magus. On the other hand, Roland's thoughts were even more complicated. His face contorted as he looked at this scene. He knew better than anyone else where these magi came from. Moreover, the one beside him was the leader of the four, yet he had his magic staff snatched away from him with just a raise of his hand. That was something that magi viewed as important as a spellbook, something that was even more important than their lives. This was simply a fantasy. The magus who had his staff snatched away was stunned. He looked at his empty hand in disbelief and subconsciously clenched his fist, as if this was a terrifying illusion. Only Brando was calm and composed, as if this scene was nothing to him. He looked at the exquisite ivory staff in his hand, and his face was gloomy. He raised his head and asked, "What did you say just now? Say it again." His question directly ignored Roland, who was at the side. It was as if he was the leader of the group, but at this moment, everyone present felt that it was only right and proper. It was as if this adventurer was born with this kind of power. After a short moment of absent-mindedness, the opposing magus finally felt this overwhelming power. He finally realized that this was not an absurd nightmare, but a reality that was happening right in front of him. Although he did not understand why he had inexplicably kicked an iron plate, the most important thing right now was to preserve his life. Chapter 1447. As a truly intelligent person, apart from those lunatics in the Black Tower, no wizard from anywhere else would be a martyr. In a situation where they knew they could not do anything, they would first choose to protect themselves. The silver-robed sorcerer quickly understood this point. He also subconsciously thought that the other party was a sorcerer of a higher level than himself. Of course, he did not believe that a warrior could take away his staff so easily. He put on a respectful expression and replied with a trembling voice. "My lord, please believe me. I have absolutely no intention to offend you. If I knew that you were so powerful, I would not have the slightest disrespect towards you." This sounded ridiculous, but it was the truth of the sorcerer world. In this world that pursued magic and power, the strong were respected, and those who had reached the top were first. If a strong sorcerer attacked a weak sorcerer, it was a matter of course, but to offend the dignity of a strong sorcerer was one of the stupidest things to do. Of course, wizards were often arrogant, especially the craftsman wizards of the Argent Society. They often agreed that they would not attack mortals. However, there were always people who did not abide by this agreement, especially when the mortals did not have eyes. Of course, this wizard would never have thought that one day, he would become one of those people who did not have eyes. However, before he could finish his words, he was interrupted by Brando. "I don't care about your nonsense." The first sentence. The first sentence. The silver-robed wizard was stunned for a moment, but then he realized something. Roland, who was standing at the side, saw this insufferably arrogant person suddenly tremble. Seeing this scene, Brando already knew what was going on. He coldly opened his mouth and said, "The ivory staff, the guardian of the secret plane of the Tower Forest. If that is the case, you have already decided to attack Erwin." Why? If the silver-robed wizard was only afraid before, then at this moment, he was on the verge of collapse. He looked at the young man standing in front of him with an incomparable fear in his eyes and screamed, "You! Who are you?" Brando was about to calm this guy down, but at this moment, a voice suddenly came from the sky. "Darien, why did you waste so much time?" The silver-robed wizard suddenly raised his head and screamed towards the sky, "Be careful, there is a companion." Before he finished his words, a zigzag of lightning had already descended from the sky like thousands of silver snakes, opening their mouths to bite Brando. However, Brando did not even move the corner of his clothes. The bright lightning did not even touch his body. It was like an illusion, automatically disappearing without a trace. The silver-robed wizard standing in front of him was so shocked that his eyeballs almost popped out. His mouth was wide enough to stuff a goose egg. This is impossible. 3 silver-robed sorcerers appeared in the sky at the same time. One of them had a broken hood. It was the bald sorcerer from before. However, they immediately raised their staffs and subconsciously wanted to cast the next spell. Unfortunately, Brendel did not want to waste his time on them. He glanced at the direction and said, "Get the hell down here." As soon as he finished speaking, a gust of wind blew. The 3 silver-robed wizards lost their footing and fell from the sky like kites with a broken string, crashing to the ground. Brando's figure flashed, and before the silver-robed wizard leader named Darien could react, he saw his 3 companions being picked up by the other party and thrown to the ground like 3 dead pigs. Silence. For a moment, the scene was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. At this time, even Heinz could see that the young man who was traveling with him was by no means an ordinary person. The silver-robed wizards in front of him were not insignificant characters at first glance. The key was that he saw the silver-white eyes on the bald wizard's face. The silver person. This detail was like a thunderbolt that landed in the depths of his heart, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably. There was only one silver person wizard in this world, and they were the craftsman wizards of the Buga people. Then who was this young man in front of him? Could it be that he was actually a giant dragon? Rolindi's face was also pale. The Earl's son's forehead was covered with dense beads of sweat. For the first time, he understood that the young man in front of him was not boasting, but could really crush him like an ant. For a moment, he did not know whether to be glad or afraid. At least he did not further anger the other party. Although some things have deviated, the inertia of history is still the same. It seems that this world's Rossard alliance is still established. Brando played with the ivory staff in his hand, his face as cold as ice. "I don't need you to answer, and I know your identity. You are the traitors of the Arcane Realm's law. You secretly betrayed your leader, Master Lone, and joined Rossard's henchmen. Isn't that right, Mr. Darien?" Rolindi heard a voice louder than his own teeth chattering. He turned his head with a pale face and found that the silver-robed wizard leader's teeth were chattering as if he had seen a ghost. "Who are you?" A woman on the ground screamed. One of the 4 silver-robed wizards was actually a woman, but Brando did not have the slightest pity for her. He waved his hand, and the female wizard suddenly screamed and crashed into the wall. The broken wall that had long been loosened should not have been able to cause any damage to a silver wizard, but Brendel had suppressed all the magical defenses on the female wizard's body, allowing her to crash into the wall with her mortal body. Even though the physique of a silver citizen was far stronger than that of a human, a wizard was still a wizard species after all. With this crash, the female wizard's body was left with only a few intact bones, and her eyes rolled back. Everyone present was suddenly silent. Even the sisters Ling and Lien. It was the first time they had seen Brando show such a cold side, and they were subconsciously afraid. But Brando's heart was not the slightest bit moved. He knew what kind of scum they were. At this time, another wizard war would not be allowed. "Now it's time for me to ask and you to answer," Brando said coldly. "Are you behind the incident at White Mountain?" At this moment, he suddenly understood everything. The good things that the Saucered Alliance had done in history were still vivid in his mind. In order to fight for the war slate, the wizards came to the mortal world and divided into 2 camps, conquering each other. In the end, the Dark-Eye Vladimir the Great betrayed the silver-robed people and threw himself into the arms of the Twilight Dragon. He secretly instigated the relationship between the elves of Saint Tassol and the undead, thus triggering the Battle of Oblique Forest. In the end, he also indirectly unlocked Akas's seal, leading to the calamity of wolves. Although the history of this world had deviated, the inertia of the world line was still there. It seemed that after the appearance of the War Slate, the Saucered Alliance was still established as in history, and the undead would not attack White Mountain at this time, so the only possibility left was the instigation of the wizards. After all, this was a precedent in the history of the Saucered Alliance. It was unknown whether it was because of Brando's thunderous methods, or because of Brando's ability to predict the future that shocked these people, but Darien did not have the intention to hide it and could only answer honestly. That was a good deed done by Lord Vladimir the Great and the wizards of Latakia. It has nothing to do with us, my respected lord. Then what are you doing here? We were ordered to stop a woman. She is Count Randner's confidant, and she has a war slate in her hands. What's the woman's name? Her name is Scarlet. Before Darien could finish his words, he was sent flying into the air. He quickly screamed, "My lord, don't kill me." Did you catch her? Brando asked as he fixed Darien in the air. No, not yet, Darien said in a panic. The mission was going smoothly, but we didn't expect a strange lizard to appear halfway. That lizard looked like a legendary planeswalker, and we fought with it. It wasn't easy to subdue it. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he asked coldly, "Did you kill it?" No, we didn't. We suspect that it is a descendant of a planeswalker, and we plan to bring it back to Taraki. Brando turned around. Hayne had already run out when he heard the conversation. He quickly shouted from outside, "Mr. Sophie, over here." Brando glanced at Darien, who was fixed in the air, and walked out of the courtyard. He saw Hayne standing in a large pit behind a broken wall. The Fireclaw lizard man Lord Ropar was lying in the deepest part of the pit with his eyes closed. His body was covered in a layer of silver runes, which was obviously sealed by the wizards. Brando felt a little strange. He had tested the strength of the wizards, and the weakest among them was at the peak of the lower realm. It seemed that Ropar had fought with them. When did it have the ability to do so? Yesterday evening, he had contacted all his planeswalker creatures. Medisha and Hippamra should still be in the middle of the trial, but Mephistopheles and Ropar were not within the range of contact. The only one he could contact was the Shire. He didn't know where the vampire's siblings were now, but he didn't expect Ropar to be so close to him, yet he couldn't contact him. What was going on? In theory, as long as there were no planes, there should not be any connection between a planeswalker and a planeswalker creature. Mr. Sophie, this is... Hayne looked at the sturdy lizard with some doubt. No matter how knowledgeable he was, he would not recognize the natives of the fire elemental plane, the Fireclaw lizard men. But Brando just waved his hand and reached out to grab the silver runes on Ropar's body. The runes on the seal disappeared without a trace. Even though they had seen Brendel's miraculous abilities before, they were still shocked by this scene. Since when did Bugha's silver wizard spells become so weak? My lord, Ropar opened his fiery red eyes, and there was a trace of surprise in his vertical pupils. Miss Scarlet has escaped. I know. Brando nodded and said gently, have a good rest. The runes have an energy absorption enchantment. After you recover, you can slowly tell me what happened. Only then did the lizard man lord slowly nod. Hayne opened his mouth and said, Mr. Sophie, you know it, and it called you my lord. So you are actually a noble. There are some things that you will understand in the end, but now is not the time, Mr. Hayne, Brando replied. But although he looked calm, he was faintly uneasy in his heart. The claws of the Saucered Alliance appeared around Erwin. This was not a good sign. Moreover, Darien had clearly shown hostility to the princess. Was their goal only to appear on Erwin's war slate? Also, why would Vladimir the Great sow discord between the elves and the undead at this time? Wasn't Taraki's city supposed to be in the arms of the Twilight Dragon after the Year of Sparks? One mystery after another took root in Brando's heart. Chapter 1448. The morning of White Mountain was shrouded in mist, and the air was filled with a bleak and cold aura. The mournful singing came from afar. The elves were cleaning up the corpses of their companions on the battlefield, and there were faint sobs, breaking the silence and tranquility under the morning light. A pair of wise eyes could see through the fog and see the darkness and tricks hidden behind it. It was this pair of dark eyes that silently watched the skeletons scattered around the battlefield. "Dear Your Majesty, let's go back. It's not safe here. Those crazy elves may rush up and tear us to pieces at any time." The Queen of Madara was unmoved. She bent down and grabbed a handful of dust from the ground with her snow-white hands, then opened her palms and let the gravel slide down from her slender fingers. "Did you see anything? It's indeed a trace of psychic black magic. It's a very clumsy framing. I can smell the stench of those rotten old guys from afar." Enrich replied. "But they don't think so." The queen pointed to the elves in the distance. Enrich could only shrug. "Let's go back," she said. "Are we really going back?" Enrich was stunned. He and Tarkus looked at each other and saw the doubt in each other's eyes. The queen was not a person who would listen to advice. Once she had her own opinion, then the empire would operate according to her will. "The matter is clear. What are we still doing here?" Her Majesty asked. "But how are we going to explain to those crazy tree thorns? In their eyes, the undead and us are on the same side." Enrich added, "In fact, we are on the same side. Don't talk nonsense. Follow me." "Your Majesty, did you notice something?" Tarkus asked. "The undead can't deal with White Mountain, not to mention they retreated before we could react. This kind of organizational ability doesn't seem to be at the level they should be at. I don't think they dare. As expected of the youngest member of the Lagan family. You are at least a little smarter than this guy, Tarkus." The Queen of Madara glanced at the one-eyed vampire. "It's the Bugas. There are deeper secrets hidden under the surface of psychic magic. I really want to find out what their purpose is." At this time, she saw someone coming from the other side of the fog, then turned and disappeared into the forest. Enrich and Tarkus looked at each other. The rotten wood of the undead actually colluded with the Bugas. Enrich asked in surprise, "What are the Bugas after?" "You'll have to ask Targus that question. He scored full marks in geography and strategy," the one-eyed vampire replied with a straight face before turning around. "But I was able to push him to the ground in my tactics class. That's why he's already the commander-in-chief of an army, while you're just a column commander. Some things can't be so straightforward, Tarkus." "I can't." Silver Dragon Harbor was burning fiercely. The water reflected the flames that soared into the sky. The creatures that were suddenly hit by the disaster were crying in the fire. The entire harbor was filled with the laughter of slaughter, the screams of despair, and the cries of women. Vladimir the Great was expressionless. His calm silver irises reflected the thousands of centaurs that poured into the harbor. The wealth that the harbor had accumulated over centuries was burned in an instant. Barbarism replaced civilization and mercilessly plundered everything, whether it was wealth, women, or lives. The corpses of the beheaded men piled up into a mountain. Blood flowed like a river, staining the steps and pouring into the bay. Then, the entire harbor was blood red. But Vladimir the Great's exquisite red silk robe was spotless, as if it was so out of place with the tragic background. A centaur with green tattoos respectfully carried a waxy yellow head to him and bowed deeply. It threw the head in front of its conqueror according to centaur tradition. It bent its knees and half knelt forward, raised its hands above its head, and presented a blood-stained silver disc. Vladimir the Great glanced at the bloody head. The original owner of the harbor, who was rich enough to rival a country and had a powerful army, dared to refuse his request and hand over the war slate. Now, the entire harbor was buried with him. His daughter was now crying and screaming under the centaur's crotch. This was the result of angering the silver folk. Those ants who were still hesitating should take this as a warning. Although the Bugas had lost the sky, they were still the best people in the world. He slowly took the disc and said, "Your servant is not bad. I have a good use for him, but this is just the interest we paid for helping you in White Mountain. We are of equal status. You don't have to expect the silver folk to be your slaves like these ignorant creatures. They are just vassals of the demons. They are not my slaves." A voice said. A shadow walked out from behind the centaur chief. She had her hands behind her back. It was the appearance of the merchant lady, but there was a cold and disdainful smile on her face. "But at least they will let you escape the accountability of the Silver Council. It proves that your Taraki and the all-seeing eye have not interfered in the affairs of the land. The council is not that easy to deceive." Vladimir the Great shook his head. "Besides, we did something in White Mountain, not to mention what we did in Erewhon. The council will find out the truth sooner or later. But I don't plan to hide it for the rest of my life. I just hope that I have enough strength to protect myself before I break with those pedantic fellows." "You will." The dusk smiled calmly. "You should know that a world is nothing to me. I will give you a world as promised and let you be its master. No matter how long you live, immortal or not, I will take back that world after you die." Vladimir the Great played with the silver disc in his hand with his slender and pale fingers. The disc reflected his cold and harsh face, long and narrow cheeks, cold eyes, mean lips and goatee. "Then let's talk about the next problem. I sent the Grey Mages to Erewhon, but I still don't know what you want. Let Erewhon be chaotic and muddy the waters. I need you to help me catch some people. That's all. That's all." Vladimir the Great shook his head. "I don't believe that your followers can't do it. No, they can't. Odin and Gretel set up a trap in Erewhon a long time ago. I suspect that they were guided by that woman and left many seals on that land. Even my subordinates don't dare to touch them. I planted a chess piece there a few years ago, but I still haven't found a chance to attack." The dusk's eyes flashed with danger and hatred. "Also, there is a troublesome person there. You must not let your guard down. Vladimir the Great will be a very difficult opponent. You're talking about that newly risen Count Trendheim, right? I didn't expect you to value a mere mortal so much. He is not a mortal. Vladimir the Great, if you think that way, you will suffer a great loss." Vladimir the Great didn't care and nodded casually. "All right, since this is the content of the deal, then I'll do it this way. I'll send Wizard Rosader to Aween personally. He's the best at bewitching people among us, and causing chaos in a small country is just a small matter to him. He won't fail. If one of the 12 leaders of the Magi failed in Amir Aween, then the Buga people wouldn't be where they are today. I hope so." The dusk took a deep look at him, and then her figure gradually disappeared into the air. Moments after she left, the centaur in front of Vladimir the Great disintegrated. Its eyeballs, hair, skin, muscles, and organs rolled down like melted wax, revealing the pale skeleton below. In the end, even the skeleton collapsed and turned into pieces on the ground. From the beginning to the end, the great Taoist master did not blink. Dilfari carefully stroked the rough stone wall in the dark and moved forward. The servant behind her wanted to raise the torch several times, but she refused. This dark and gloomy basement hid the deepest shadow in the heart of the Count Yinbao's daughter. This was Yinbao's dark prison. She was familiar with every inch of this place. Whenever she was immersed in the darkness, she could not help but recall the days when she learned and used demonic spells. The dark magic devoured her flesh and soul, and the screams from the deepest part of hell seemed to still linger in her ears. Several times, she almost became a sacrifice to the demons, and her best childhood playmate also died in a magic experiment. She still did not dare to recall the bloody scene, the snow-white body parts scattered in the dark room, the unwilling eyes, piercing her heart like the tip of a knife. But revenge burned her heart like a flame. Only in this way, only by selling her soul, could she take back her father's family business and save him. She suddenly stopped in front of a cell, and the faint sound of metal chains came from the darkness. At that moment, the moonlight just happened to pass through the iron bars of the skylight above the dark prison, and the pale light fell on Dilferi's face. After a quarter of an hour that seemed to last forever, a weak and incredulous voice came from the darkness. "Dilferi, is that you? Did they capture you too?" "It's me, father. I'm back." A white-haired old man groped and slowly moved from the other side of the prison to his daughter. Dilferi remembered the last time she saw her father. He was high-spirited and a handsome middle-aged man, but only 4 years of prison life destroyed all his energy and body. Chapter 1449. But there was still a pair of cloudy eyes, burning with the strongest desire to survive in the darkness. The old man reached out his trembling hand through the wooden fence and grabbed his daughter's hand. "Is this true?" Dilferi felt the big hand that was like dry bark rubbing her hand, and tears finally came out of her eyes. The torment she had suffered night after night seemed to be repaid at this moment. Yes, she was back. Back to Yenbao. On the land that gave birth to her. When the situation between the north and south began to ease, she begged the princess to give her an army so that she could take back everything that originally belonged to her. Although Amandina hoped that she could wait until Brando came back, how could her father wait until that moment? Fortunately, Amandina agreed to her request, and when she returned to the north, the eldest son of the king also helped her as much as he could. Whether it was all this, or the fleet behind her, Dilferi understood that it was all because of the kindness of the count. Perhaps that fated meeting in Ampere Seal was the turning point for all of this. Lady Martha had never given up on her, even if she had fallen into the arms of darkness. Opened the door of the cell. She reluctantly let go of her father's hand, and ordered with the dignity that the daughter of the Count of Yenbao should have. The attendants did as they were told, but Count Yenbao's body seemed to be too weak, or perhaps meeting his daughter again had exhausted all his mental and physical strength. At this moment, he had fallen into a deep sleep. Dilferi did not dare to disturb him. She motioned for the attendants to be gentle and carefully sent the count to his room. He really did need a good rest, at least he did not need to be frightened anymore. In her memory, her father was a determined person, someone who could shelter her from the wind and rain. Perhaps it was this perseverance that allowed him to insist on not revealing the family's secret under the torment of the situation. And in the end, this also saved his life. The countess sighed slightly. She looked at the old man who was sleeping soundly on the bed, then closed the door and turned to walk out. At the end of the corridor, on the castle's balcony, 2 young officers were talking on the balcony. When they saw her walk out, they turned and saluted. "Mr. Manrique, you are Mr. Brando's subordinate, you don't have to be so polite to me." "And you too, Mr. Breton." Dilferi knew the 2 young men in front of her. The former was one of the best captains that the Bugis had trained for Valhalla, and he was one of Amandina's most trusted aides. Amandina had allowed him to go with her to Yenbao, which showed how much respect the leader of ABs had for her. The latter was Brando's childhood companion. Although it was said that the 2 of them once had a grudge against each other, they had since buried the hatchet. Moreover, the 2 of them, one in the north and the other in the south, now had their own futures. Everything in the past had long gone with the wind. The other party was specially selected by the king's eldest son, Levin, to prove that her right to inherit Yenbao was recognized by the Cipher royal family. But in fact, this young genius of Erewhon, who already had the title of Sword of the White Lion, also led an army. Obviously, the king's eldest son also understood that the current situation in Yenbao was tantamount to a rebellion. But the expected battles along the way did not happen. The rebels in Yenbao seemed to have received news in advance. Other than encountering slight resistance when they reclaimed the family's castle, everything else was considered smooth sailing. Dilferi was originally worried that her sinister uncle would take her father away, but Count Yenbao seemed to have been forgotten in a corner of the dark prison. After they reclaimed the castle, they rescued him from the damp and dark underground. Everything went unbelievably smoothly, and even made people feel a little uneasy. Even Dilferi herself did not understand where her uncle, her father's brother, the usurper, had gone. What about the residents of Yenbao, the army? It seemed that they had all disappeared overnight. When Breton heard Dilferi mention that person's name, he could not help but shake his head. He could not help but feel the vicissitudes of the past rising in his heart. Who would have thought that this day would come? Captain Martin would never have dreamed that his 3 prized disciples would become the 3 superpowers of the kingdom. And the most useless of them all had the highest achievements today. Perhaps it was because of his background, or perhaps it was because of his identity as the descendant of Darius, but he had turned the tide in the Battle of Ampere Seal. No one could deny that it was a miracle. Brando, Freya, how are the 2 of you now? Thinking of that guy who had always been at odds with him, at this moment, had become a heavy memory that pressed down on his heart. Ever since the Battle of Ampere Seal, he understood that he had lost the final opportunity to fight with that despicable guy. So he withdrew from that battle and came to the north alone. Here, he had a new beginning, a new love. Now, he had his own career and a direction to fight for. And all those feelings and memories of the past had now become the most beautiful fantasies of his youth. While Breton was distracted for a moment, Manrique had already bowed to Dilferi. You came at the right time, Miss Dilferi. We were just discussing something related to you. Oh, what's the matter? Look over here. Manrique came to the edge of the balcony and pointed at a forest not far away. These things are a little strange. Have they always been here? No, Dilferi shook her head. I've never seen these things before. At least, they didn't exist before I left Yenbao. It was a forest located in the north of Yenbao. In Dilferi's memory, it was a forest that was evergreen all year round. There was also a garden in the forest that carried her childhood memories. The forest that was lush in the summer would be dyed with a layer of ink in the winter, and then it would start to snow. When the ground and forest were covered in snow, it would be the annual hunting day in Yenbao. She still remembered the hustle and bustle of the place. Regardless of whether it was adults or children, their faces would be filled with happiness during the new year, as if they were looking forward to the coming year. But now, the forest had become twisted and terrifying. Purple crystals grew in the forest, and the surface of the tree bark reflected an unnatural luster. Under the moonlight, the luster was eerie. The cold light was like the gaze of a ghost, and it made people shudder. In the depths of the forest, there stood an ancient ruin. The huge dark building weighed down on everyone's hearts, making it hard to breathe. I've seen similar things in some areas in the north of Balta, Breton suddenly said. These ruins appeared in many places overnight, but the scholars haven't figured out their origins. They only suspect that it might be related to the fall of the Black Moon not long ago. You suspect that this place appeared overnight? Manrique asked. The changes in the forest might be related to these ruins. Miss Dilferi's answer also confirms our guess. No, I think the changes in the forest might be related to something else. What's wrong? Both of them turned to look at the Count's daughter at the same time. Long before I left Yenbao, I've heard some rumors. For example, there were monsters in the forest, and huge crystals, Dilferi recalled. The shadow of the past seemed to have shrouded her heart again. She frowned. Since then, the people in the territory have been in a state of panic. Miss Dilfery, do you have any misgivings? Breton said. Why don't you just say it? The Count's daughter hesitated. For a moment, she seemed to be a little weak, but soon became determined. Mr. Manrique, Mr. Breton, because this is related to a secret of my family, my father might have encountered all of this. I've always suspected this, but until today, I've decided to say it. Miss Dilfery, if this is your family's secret, no, the two of you, I trust Mr. Brando. You are his subordinates and friends, I think I can entrust this to you. Entrust us. Miss Dilfery, forgive us for not quite understanding. Please follow me. In the basement. The moment Dilfery opened the black wooden box, she felt the two people behind her subconsciously hold their breaths. This is the Lionheart sword. But how is that possible, isn't it? And Breton and Manrique's faces were filled with astonishment. The Count's daughter used a gentle gaze to look at the shining sword lying flat in the wooden box. Then, she reluctantly closed the box again. She turned around and looked at the two people behind her. This is not the Lionheart sword, the Lionheart sword is just a replica. What? This is related to the most important secret of the Yenbao family. You should know the origin of my family. It is the product of a compromise between the people of Cruz and the elves of Saint Osol. Our ancestors migrated here from the Cruz Empire and established the Yenbao Count's territory. Dilfery paused for a moment before continuing. You should know that when the late King Eric brought the Lionheart sword out of the Empire, that sword is actually the product of the sacred sword Oderfeis being divided into 3 parts. This is because the Flame King Gretel left a decree to one of his most trusted knights. If one day the people of Cruz forget the glory of their ancestors, then the soul of the sacred sword of Oderfeis will leave his descendants and search for a true Pure Land. In the legends passed down from generation to generation in my family, this decree is true, but it is related to the agreement between the Flame King Gretel and another important person. That person could be the sage Alanta, or the Wind Empress that Gretel has always been deeply in love with, Saint Osol. Because of this agreement, my family brought another sacred sword to this land and took root here. After hundreds of years, we call ourselves the Sword Guardians of Yenbao, and the world thinks that we are the sword throne of the Lionheart sword. Chapter 1450. In fact, what we have been guarding for generations is actually this sacred sword. Dilfery patted the wooden box gently. Its name is Mither, and it's a light sacred sword. It used to be Fanzin's treasure, but I don't know how it ended up in the hands of Gretel, the Flame King. Then, he ordered my family to bring it to this land in secret. Breton and Manrique looked as if they had heard something ridiculous, and their faces were filled with astonishment. But why would the Flame King go through so much trouble to do this? The young captain couldn't help but ask. This doesn't make sense. Dilfery shook her head. I don't understand either, but this is a legend passed down from generation to generation in my family, and the sacred sword does indeed exist here. I shouldn't know about this, but before my father was framed and imprisoned by my uncle, he secretly told me everything. I understand what he meant. He entrusted the future of Yenbao to me. So, Baron Dahl has been interrogating your father about the whereabouts of the sacred sword, and your father didn't say anything, so he wasn't killed? Dilfery nodded. But what does it mean to Erwin? What does the Lionheart sword mean to him? Manrique still found it hard to accept that the sacred sword in the hands of the Valkyrie was a fake. Other than the Lord, she was the person he admired the most. Could it be that the Lionheart sword in the hands of the Cipher royal family and the Corvado royal family has always been fake? No, the Lionheart sword is real. Although it was forged in imitation of the brilliant light, it contains the soul of Osiris. But within it is the soul of the holy sword Oderfeis, and it carries the faith of the late King Eric. The oath on the sword has always bound Owain, symbolizing the soul of this country. Then, what does this sacred sword mean? I think there is one person who may understand all of this. Dilfari thought of something and said softly, "My uncle's ambition is not small. I suspect that this is a conspiracy. Perhaps it is no longer safe for the sacred sword to stay in Yenbao today, so I hope you can take it to the south, to a safer place." "You mean Brando?" Breton asked. The Count once resonated with the holy sword Oderfeis in Rushte. "I think he must know something about the secret behind the holy sword of fire and the holy sword of light," Dilfari replied. Breton and Manrique looked at each other. "And you, Miss Dilfari?" "Of course I'm staying here. My father hasn't recovered yet. After some time, I'll attend the peace conference in Ampere Seal. At that time, if Mr. Brando has already returned to Erewhon, I will personally tell him everything." Manrique shook his head. "It's not safe here, Miss Dilfari. We didn't catch Baron Dahl. He might still be hiding in the dark. If we leave, it will be difficult to guarantee the safety of you and the Count." "Maybe we can do this," Breton thought for a while and said, "Yenbao's revival isn't something that can be done in a day. Maybe we can split into 2 groups. I'll escort Miss Dilfari to Balta, where the royal family's territory is. You can go there as guests. As for the holy sword, Mr. Manrique will escort it to the south. Compared to our respective positions, he's more suitable for this task." "That's not a bad idea," Manrique agreed with this suggestion. Dilfari was slightly hesitant. She had finally returned to her homeland and reclaimed it. She didn't want to leave it so easily. But she also understood that Manrique and Breton had a point. She didn't have any soldiers at hand, and the old and weak servants in the castle were not enough to protect her and her father. She was about to nod, but at this moment, there was a knock on the door. Her knight Captain Ronan's voice came from outside. "We might not be able to go anywhere, Mississippi, what happened?" Breton frowned. Just now, when Nia was patrolling outside, she was attacked. An army suddenly surrounded Yenbao. "That's impossible," Breton said angrily. "Where are my subordinates? Aren't they stationed outside the city?" "The camp outside the city was attacked, my lord," Ronan replied calmly. "I've already ordered my men to open the gate and let your men in. There are many enemies outside, some very strange enemies." "Strange? How is Nia?" Dilfari asked nervously. "Is anyone hurt?" "There are many injured people, but Nia is fine," Ronan's voice paused. "Mr. Breton, do you want to go up the wall and take a look?" The 3 people in the secret room looked at each other. "Of course." Breton pulled out his sword and replied in a deep voice. Capello town had always been the only way to count Yenbao's territory from Corvado. During peacetime, Yenbao was one of the 2 important entrances to the empire. Thus, as a thoroughfare connecting the empire's central and border areas, Capello town was once a flourishing and densely populated town. However, since the Frost Rebellion, the empire's ruling center had gradually shifted to Cipher and Ampere Seal. Capello town's position was gradually replaced by Count Yenbao's territory in the south. It began to decline from prosperity. Since the beginning of the Yenbao rebellion 4 years ago, the new ruler of Yenbao had doubled the exploitation of the passing merchants, and the commercial activities on this road had become more and more desolate. Until today, this place had become a trade center in the past, and had become a deserted and withered town. However, the town's original size still remained. The stronghold that was built to protect the merchants was still standing at the northern pass of Grey Mountain. This was the territory of the Corvado royal family, so there were night patrols here. However, there was something special today. The knight, who should have returned by now, was nowhere to be seen. Warhorses that had lost their masters wandered around the mountain pass. Battle robes with the emblem of the royal family of stars, moon, and silver lily were scattered among the rocks. Broken armors, broken swords, cold corpses, and flowing blood in the valley seemed to be telling the story of a tragic battle. A silent army was marching forward along the valley. The dense crowd of people seemed to occupy the entire field of vision. Occasionally, a few gray wolves of Corvado would pass through the rocks in the valley, watching the endless march with cold eyes. On Capello's watchtower, the sentinel Willian was finally awakened by his companion. The cold morning air made him shrink his neck involuntarily. "Is it time to change shifts?" he mumbled. But before he could finish his words, his companion covered his mouth. Ugh! Willian smelled a nauseating stench that almost made him roll his eyes. "Damn it! What are you doing? Did you just poop?" "Shut up, Willian. Do you want to die?" His companion's frightened gaze finally calmed him down. The man pointed outside and said, "Look outside." "Outside?" "Inside the valley." "Damn it! What is that?" Willian pushed his companion away and climbed to the top of the battlements. He gasped. "Where did that army come from? Is it the army from before? Did they come back from Yenbao?" "That's the White Lion Legion. But these are different. Look at their flags. Their flags are different." Willian squinted his eyes and tried to identify the black flags. He tried to compare the flags with the ones he could remember, but he couldn't find any that matched them. There was an explosion in his mind, and a thought that almost made him tremble suddenly flashed through his mind. "Quick! Quick!" He trembled and said to his companion, "It's not our people. It's Yenbao. Yenbao must have rebelled. What do we do?" "Go and sound the alarm, you damn idiot." When the sound of the alarm reverberated over the whole of Capello, the shrill sound of the bell echoed in Erewhon's late winter. It finally spread throughout the mountains from Balta to Cipher. Levin. Ornazin sat in the carriage, looking gently at a lighthouse in the distance. The blue sea of the glittering sea sparkled under the sun. That was the last lighthouse on the Cape of Ampere Seal. It marked the end of Erewhon's southern border. Further north, past Pelican Fort, was the land of Cipher. The prince's light blue eyes did not blink. It was as if he could really see all this, but the emptiness in his blue-gray pupils blocked all the beautiful scenery between heaven and earth. He was not calm. This trip to the south, he had sent away his most beloved sister, but he had achieved the results he wanted most. Erewhon's future, for the first time, seemed so real and within reach. It was right in front of him, as if everything was developing for the best. Since the Frost Rebellion, the kingdom had been in constant turmoil. It seemed that at the end of this year, it would really come to an end. Although the nobles whose interests were hurt would more or less retaliate, most people had already stood on the side of the royal family. Everyone seemed to have had enough of the long-term division and war. People began to feel tired. They finally put down the burden of the past and began to move forward again. Since the defeat of Duke Arek in the Battle of Ampere Seal, Erewhon had shown such signs, and he had only made it come earlier. "Edessa," Levin suddenly said softly, "if my dream is realized, what about yours?" "My dream is to be with your highness forever and be your highness's eyes. You always say what I like, but I want to hear what's in your heart." "This is all true, your highness," the maid replied softly, "because only I understand the dream in your highness' heart. It is so tall and so glorious. I am willing to remember every detail of it in my heart and tell it to the people who come after me. But if there is a dream," her voice became expectant, "I do have such an ideal, your highness. Oh. I hope that one day, your highness can regain the light and see with your own eyes what you have achieved, the smiles of people, and the future of this kingdom." "Levin." Ornazin suddenly fell silent. Chapter 1451. Levin. Ornizon suddenly fell silent. He felt a trickle of warmth flowing in his heart. He suddenly took his little maid's hand and held it tightly. I will see the long darkness, Edessa. In this way, you can always be by my side and be my eyes. Your Highness, at this moment, the carriage was filled with silent warmth, as well as plans and hopes for the future. But good times were always so short. Suddenly, the carriage stopped. Your Highness, there's a small accident ahead. The voice of the captain of the night came from outside the carriage. What's wrong? It seems that a noble gentleman's carriage has broken down. Shall we stop and wait for them to deal with it first? Levin. A trace of uneasiness suddenly flashed in Ornizon's heart. No, don't stop, Captain of the Night, let the convoy move on. Yes, Your Highness. In the darkness, the knight's voice suddenly turned into a sharp howl. Then, the king's eldest son felt the entire carriage shake violently, as if the world had turned upside down. In the chaos, he heard the screams of the people, the panicked shouts of Edessa, the angry roars of the soldiers, and the clashing of weapons. But these sounds seemed to be gradually fading away. Levin. Ornizon felt a stabbing pain in his chest, and a burning sensation spread in an instant. In the end, only Edessa's panicked and low cries were left in his ears. In the darkness, he groped weakly in that direction and reached out to hold his maid's hand. Hold my hand, Edessa, I'm so uncomfortable that I can't breathe. Your Highness, I'm here, Edessa is here. Edessa cried out in panic. Levin suddenly smiled. He actually felt a ray of light in the darkness. In the flickering shadows, he saw Edessa's face full of blood. His mother did not lie to him, Edessa was beautiful. He opened his palm and stuffed a cold thing into the maid's palm. Be my eyes, Edessa, take a good look at the world for me, and Erewhon's future, Your Highness. Edessa's screams gradually faded away from him. The whole world seemed to be leaving him. In the darkness, he seemed to see many things. His father, Erewhon, the cowardly king, and his mother, the woman who played tricks behind his back. Then everything in the past, but they all gradually disappeared. He seemed to have seen an Erewhon that he had never seen before. That kingdom was sinking in darkness and burning in flames. Living beings were crying and struggling in pain. Everything was destroyed, whether it was hope or the road ahead. The last prince of House Cypher felt a faint sense of loss. He felt as if he had missed a line of fate that didn't exist. Several hundred meters in the air, two pairs of silver eyes were coldly watching this scene. I've heard that this prince has a good reputation, but it's a pity that fate makes fools of people. The beginning of a tragedy always ends in a tragedy. He was never going to be able to obtain the coveted throne, a voice said. The tragedy of mortals, another voice replied, those ephemeral things are things that can only be looked at but not reached. This is the greatest tragedy of those who cannot control their own fate, and that is why he died, on the road from Ampere Seal to Pelican Fort. The knight was in a mess, tangling with the pagans who had suddenly appeared. The inconspicuous carriage in the middle of the convoy was overturned on the ground, burning fiercely. This scene was like a farce. From the beginning to the end, it was filled with a dark sense of humor, but to different people, it had different meanings. But no matter what, from this day onwards, Erewhon's history was forever changed. Duke Vero sat down in his chair, a little tired. Not long ago he had seen off the last group of guests, and these days he had to deal with all kinds of people, some of whom he knew, some of whom he did not, some of whom he did not know, some of whom he was harmless, and some of whom he shuddered at the mere sight of them. Fortunately, it was all over. He felt a deep sense of powerlessness surging from the depths of his heart. It was a state of entanglement of exhaustion, uneasiness, and nervousness, as if it was a viscous liquid that wrapped around him, making it difficult for him to breathe. He regretted the moment he made the decision, but a deep sense of fear made him unable to stop. He could only complete the deal that made him feel uneasy mechanically. He confirmed it again and again, and the voice in the crystal ball reassured him again and again. Finally, on this day, everything was ready, but he felt a sense of emptiness. Have I really gone against them? Will everything really go according to plan? Will those people really abide by the agreement? The Duke closed his eyes in pain, rubbing each of his fingers into his silver hair. At the border of Valendon, the soldiers guarding the area were vigilantly watching the grey-robed men of unknown origins board the carriage, holding the invitation letter from the Gorse castle. They passed through the border between Vero and the deadly tundra and entered Lantern Island's territory. One of the grey-robed mages turned around before boarding the carriage, lifting his hood with his hand. His silver eyes stared in Bernicel's direction and smiled coldly. There was a grand banquet going on there. Eek stood beside his wife, watching her gently holding his daughter, the baby girl, the future of the Ophelia family. The first cry of this new life seemed to announce the end of the past and the hope of the future. The two snuggled up to each other, feeling each other's warmth. They stood on the balcony of the Count's mansion, watching the people coming and going at the grand banquet below. It was a grand banquet rarely seen in Lantern Island. People had started preparing for it a month ago. Wine and food were brought in from Bernicel's manor outside. The streets were covered with curtains and ribbons with the Ophelia coat of arms, and the flagstones were sprinkled with flower petals. From Grimoires, Vero, Karsuk, and even Erech to Ampere Seal in the north. Even the Holy Cathedral of Fire and Her Royal Highness sent envoys to congratulate the princess. The locals also gathered to celebrate their little princess. When night fell, the festive atmosphere did not dissipate. The lights were lit up, embellishing the city and the forest even brighter and more resplendent. A rare night market appeared on the streets, something that had almost never happened since the year of frost. Entertainers performed under the light of the bonfires, and the crowd cheered. Every hotel was brightly lit, and the lights were like a river, converging towards the Count's mansion in the middle of the town. Everyone who came to participate in the banquet had a warm smile on their faces. Even the fatigue and scars of the past were ironed out by the arrival of a new life. The people seemed to be looking forward to Aween's beautiful future. Uncle Makarov said he'll be here soon. He'll give our daughter his blessings. Eek lowered his head and whispered into his wife's ear with tenderness. Yura smiled gently. You're troubling him again, Eek. If I didn't call him here, this sly fox of the kingdom would have fought us. He said he'd educate our daughter himself, so she won't be as weak as me in the future. You're not weak at all, Yura looked up and replied. Even though she could not see, she could still see her husband's face. You're a real man, Eek. Eek smiled silently. In the crowd below, Haruz looked at the little girl in front of him who was about the same age as him with some surprise. She was a beautiful, porcelain doll-like, somewhat arrogant little girl. She had a pair of bright eyes, light purple hair, and wore a doll-like dress. She tilted her head and looked at the future king of Erewhon. Do you eat such a sumptuous meal every time? You're so rich. It's you. Haruz almost shouted. My name is Micaiah. Last time in Shallow Water Town, thank you for your hospitality, but I really don't have much money. You won't ask me to treat you back, will you? As the little girl spoke, she took out her empty little pocket, as if to prove her words. Why are you here? Because I'm a local. Isn't that obvious? Haruz looked back for the others, but Miss Lasmika was nowhere to be seen. She probably went shopping with her dark elf companions, and Sheeta probably went somewhere to steal food. Only then did he turn back. So, have you found your family? The little girl wrinkled her nose cutely. Probably. Probably. It means something like that. She was suddenly a little impatient, and her tone was not at all as cute as it was the last time they met. Do you always have so many questions? You're condescending, and it feels like you're ordering me around. Do I? Hearse asked a little guiltily. The girl nodded, and she suddenly grabbed the little prince's hand. Come with me. Wait, wait. Hearse felt as if he had been hit by something all of a sudden, and he was so nervous that his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He subconsciously felt that he should stay at the banquet and wait for the others to come back and join him, but involuntarily, his steps were light as a feather as he followed the little girl out. Where are we going? He asked uneasily when he saw the little girl pulling him further and further away. To save your life, of course. What? Before he finished speaking, a loud noise suddenly came from the Count's mansion behind him, and the vibration sent both of them flying, rolling a few times before they fell to the ground. When Hearse looked up in a daze, he only saw flames soaring into the sky in that direction. Amid the smoke, screams of the guests could be heard. Something happened. Hearse's heart quivered, and he immediately realized what had happened. Chapter 1452. Oh no, Sheeta and Mr. Carglass are still inside. Thinking of this, Hearse ignored the abrasions on his face and arms, got up and rushed to the Count's mansion, but Micaiah stretched out her foot and tripped him, and he fell face first. What are you doing? Hearse looked at Micaiah's prank angrily. Their target is you, do you really want to go back? Them? Yes. Micaiah raised her chin in the direction of the Count's mansion, which was ablaze. Hearse looked back and saw several nobles dressed as guests rushing out of the smoke, but there was no panic on their faces. Instead, they were calm and almost indifferent. More importantly, they had a mysterious tattoo on their cheeks, and their eyes were a strange silver in the dark environment. Hearse almost screamed when he saw those inhuman eyes. He subconsciously reached for his sword, but he touched nothing. Only then did he remember that he had left his weapon in the room. Hearse groaned inwardly, but when he saw those people rushing towards him, he quickly turned his head and desperately winked at Micaiah, motioning her to go first. But Micaiah was unmoved. She watched as those people came closer, but they stopped and swept their eyes over Hearse. Strange, where is he? Did I see him coming this way? Another person was silent. He raised his hand and a silver ripple swept in this direction. He frowned. The breath of dark magic is so strong. Was he rescued by the witches? Can you track them in the direction of the magic flow? Do you want to go to Bunasan and fight the witches? Come on, let's go back. The little prince can't go far. Let's go intercept the baby girl first. Those people stood right in front of his nose and spoke. Hearse felt his heart almost stop, but he didn't even dare to breathe. After waiting for them to turn and leave, he was sweating profusely as if he had been fished out of the water. He gasped and said, "They are Buga. Why are they here?" "To catch you, of course, the future king of Erewhon." Hearse looked at the girl in surprise. "Who are you?" "Obviously, a witch. Didn't you hear it just now?" "But how old are you?" "Some people were already kings when they were my age. I'm not the king yet." Micaiah only wrinkled his nose. Hearse stood up, patted the dust off his clothes, and said, "Thank you for saving me, Micaiah, but I still have to go back." "You'll only be courting death if you go back." "Even if that's the case, I still have to go back. Besides, if their target is me, it's not necessarily safe outside. I have to warn Mr. Eek. I really have to hand it to you." "Okay, I'll go with you." Micaiah also patted the dust off her skirt with her small hand, stood up and replied. "Miss Micaiah." Hearse was stunned. "You don't have to take the risk with me, don't try to show off. Erewhon, the future king, are you going to refuse my help?" The little girl rolled her eyes at him. Heartwarming was speechless. The little girl waved her hand at him. "Come, this way." Her figure disappeared into the side alley like a kitten. Heartwarming hesitated for a moment before following. The banquet hall was a mess. A moment ago, the scene of bright lights and laughter had been replaced by a scene of panic. Thick smoke billowed in the courtyard, and flames soared everywhere. The long table was overturned by the panicked crowd. The snow-white tablecloth was trampled on by countless footprints. Broken cups and plates were scattered on the ground, and fruits were rolling everywhere. Bright red wine overflowed on the stone floor and flowed across the ground, mixing with the scarlet blood. There were wounded everywhere. Screams and painful groans rose and fell one after another. The panicked crowd was scrambling to rush out of the courtyard. From time to time, delicate ladies were knocked to the ground, but no one cared. Some people were scalded by the smoke, covering their eyes and rolling around on the ground. Some people were calling for their families and loved ones. Cries and shouts could be heard everywhere. The violent explosion caused a corner of the Count's mansion to completely collapse. Eek pushed with his hand, and the rubble that fell on him slid away. His face looked full of blood, but in fact, it was only a superficial wound in the explosion. He glanced at his wife. Yura was hugging their daughter. Her face was pale as she leaned against him tightly. Thankfully, she was safe. The young Duke breathed a sigh of relief. He raised his head and looked at the miserable scene in the courtyard with a gloomy face. The late court Archmage Fleetwood was his teacher. Although he was only a knight, he had a deep understanding of magic. He could tell that it was not an explosion at all, but a premeditated magic attack. Eek saw his captain of the guards running over from afar with a team of Lantern Island Knight. Seeing that his master was safe, he could not help but breathe a sigh of relief. He said anxiously, "Sir, it's not safe here. Please move to a safer place with Madam and Miss immediately." "Where are our soldiers?" Eek asked angrily. "How could so many people with bad intentions sneak into Bernisol and even enter my daughter's banquet?" "Sir, now is not the time to talk about this." The guard captain replied, "The patrolling cavalrymen have not responded yet. Sir Chanos might have been killed. Those people were disguised as guests at the banquet. Every one of them had proof of identity. This must be a despicable scheme." Eek replied with gritted teeth. He patted his captain's shoulder and said, "Hold on here for a while, my captain. As the lord of this place, I must stay. But before that, I must protect my wife and child." "As you wish, my lord." The captain of the guards bowed to him. "Yura, this way." Eek turned back to look at the burning courtyard one last time before leaving with his beloved wife. The captain watched the Duke's figure disappear completely before he turned back and ordered the knight, "Guard this passage. Before the Duke returns, no one is allowed to leave without permission." "Understood." Sheeta was hiding behind a low fence at the moment. He saw the knight spread out and set up a defense with his own eyes. The moment the explosion happened, he reacted and dived into the bushes. He was extremely timid, and now he was scared out of his wits. He trembled and did not dare to show his head at all. Although he knew that his most important duty now was to protect the safety of the little prince, he was in a dilemma, hesitating whether to take the risk. He felt that the knight in front of him might be able to help him, but who knew what they would think? They might even kill him. Sheeta felt that he could not even protect himself. His teeth chattered as if he had completely lost the ability to keep calm. Just as he was hesitating, a few noble guests suddenly rushed out of the thick smoke and headed straight for the Earl's mansion. The knight saw this and immediately shouted at these people to stop immediately. However, not only did the intruders ignore him, they even sped up. The captain of Duke Anthony's guards was the first to feel that something was wrong and instinctively pulled out his longsword. One of the noble guests suddenly stopped and tore off his coat. He raised his hand and pointed at the captain of the guards. The captain of the guards immediately screamed and flew into the air, falling into the sea of fire behind him. The knight seemed to have woken up from a dream and pounced on the intruders. However, the intruders each took out a cane from under their coat and tapped it with their hands. Silver beams of light suddenly flashed in the courtyard. The thick armor of the Anthony knight seemed to be as thin as paper under these silver beams of light and was easily penetrated. Amidst the continuous screams, the battle was declared over in an instant. From the death of the captain of the guards to the last knight falling on the path of the charge, only a few minutes had passed. The few noble guests who killed the guards took off their coats, revealing the silver tattoos on the back of their hands and necks. When Sheeta saw the cold silver eyes on these people's faces, he was so frightened that he almost couldn't maintain the magical transformation that the mages had cast in advance and turned back into his dragon form. At this moment, he naturally understood that this was a premeditated attack, and the attacker was an old acquaintance of the dragons, the Buga Grey Mage. Oh my god, the Buga people must be crazy. Yes, they are crazy to begin with. I have to think of something, Sheeta, you have to think of something. Something has happened to the little prince, you have to save him, Sheeta, don't be afraid, you have to think of that terrible woman, she'll go crazy, no, but it's still too dangerous outside, I'll die. He was muttering nervously. Finally, when a grey mage turned his head, he found this guy hiding in the bushes with his butt sticking out. He turned and walked over in this direction. At that moment, Sheeta only felt that the sky was falling down. He felt that he was definitely going to die and that death had come to him. The boundless fear finally made him let out a shrill scream and turned his head to hit a nearby outer wall, directly smashing a hole in the outer wall. Then, he fainted. The grey mage stopped and looked at all of this with his mouth agape. What's wrong? His companion asked. Nothing, a little fatty. The grey mage shook his head in disbelief. Is he still alive? Let's end him. No, I think he's already dead, said the grey mage, glancing at the gap in the wall with lingering fear. Oh my god, this guy is really strong. Chapter 1453. When Carglass woke up from the violent concussion, he subconsciously touched his forehead. It was covered in blood, but after a careful examination of his body, he found that there were no external injuries. He groaned and pushed away the rubble on his body. Only then did he realize that the blood on his body came from the outside. A completely stiff corpse was lying face down on the rubble. It was an armored knight with the emblem of the Ophelia family on his grey armor. Carglass's mind was in a mess, but he still checked to see if the knight was still alive. There was no doubt that the knight had been dead for a long time. The fatal wound was a penetrating wound on his back that tore through his heart and lungs. He touched the curled armor with his hand, deep in thought. It was impossible for this wound to be caused by an explosion. This meant that someone had artificially created the explosion and attacked the guards of the Count's mansion. Carglass's heart skipped a beat. The first thing he thought of was who these people were targeting. Was it Duke Anthony or the young prince? Shit. He was the accompanying military officer of this diplomatic group, and as the captain of the White Lion Guards who arrived in Lantern Island with the diplomatic group, it was his natural duty to protect His Highness Heroes. If anything happened to the young prince, not only would he be too ashamed to face his lord, but he would also be a sinner of heroin. Carglass broke out in a cold sweat. The pain in his body seemed to have disappeared in an instant. He got up from the ground, picked up the knight's sword, and walked out of the courtyard. There was no one in the courtyard. The half-collapsed Count's mansion was still burning, and the sound of something breaking could be heard from time to time. Dozens of the knight's corpses were scattered all over the place. Carglass couldn't help but take a deep breath. He had a new estimation of the scale of this attack. He suddenly thought of something and put his hand into his pocket. There was a ruby pin in it. The ruby was actually a communication crystal that could be used to communicate with each other within a certain distance. Carglass took out the pin and placed his hand on the ruby and the metal base of the pin. However, his mind was in a mess. He tried a few times but failed to activate the ruby's function. Just as he was getting anxious, a cry of surprise came from not far away. "Mr. Carglass." Carglass immediately looked up. He saw Heroes running towards him with Micaiah. "Mr. Carglass, it's great that you're all right." I should be the one saying that. Carglass felt as if he had been reborn. He looked at the future king of Erewhon from head to toe. After confirming that he was indeed unharmed, he let out a long sigh of relief. "Where have you been, Prince Heroes?" "Micaiah saved me," Heroes replied and introduced. "She is Micaiah. Teacher knows her too." In fact, they had only met Micaiah once in Shallow Water Town. However, Heroes knew that his elder sister did not like him hanging out with people of unknown origins. He felt a little guilty when he introduced Micaiah. However, Carglass did not mind at all. He was just a little surprised that his lord knew this little girl. He took a closer look at the little girl and thought that she was indeed a beauty. "Thank you very much, Miss Micaiah," said Carglass to Carglass. In front of a stranger, Micaiah was very well behaved. She lifted her skirt and bowed to Carglass. "Mr. Carglass, I'm afraid this was a premeditated attack." Heroes then told him what he saw. Carglass frowned. He had already expected this, but when he heard that the attackers were Bugas, he couldn't help but feel troubled. In the eyes of the average person, the Bugas were the descendants of the Silver family. Needless to say, as sorcerers, they were naturally strong. Their empire in the sky was unreachable to mortals. Of course, at this time of the year, not many people in Erewhon, including Carglass, knew that the Bugas sky empire had been destroyed. However, no matter what, it was a suffocating matter to be an opponent of such a colossus. However, he was full of doubts. Tonajol and the Bugas had always been on good terms. The Bugas had even helped his lord build a fleet. Not to mention the relationship between Tumen and Erewhon. Could it be that Duke Anthony had offended the Bugas and caused them to seek revenge? However, this did not seem to explain why they were looking for the little prince. "What do we do next, Mr. Carglass?" Heroes asked. Carglass turned around and looked in the direction of the Earl's mansion. The main door of the mansion was wide open, and he could vaguely see the corpses of a few knights in the hall. It seemed that Duke Anthony had left first, and the attackers had gone in that direction. However, he was curious as to why the attackers were interested in Alara, the newborn baby girl. "If all of this is true," he replied, "then Bernasol may not be safe. It won't be easy for us to escape from here. Your Highness Heroes, you have a good idea. If we can contact Mr. Eek and the others, it is indeed a feasible way. Even though this place was attacked, the Lantonians still have troops in Bernasol." He paused and couldn't help but complain, "It's a pity that we don't know where they went. We also don't know where Miss Lasmika and her friends went. Of course, there's also that bastard Sheeta." "Mr. Carglass, Micaiah might have a way," Heroes suddenly said. Carglass looked at the little girl. The little girl nodded and replied in a childish voice, "My lord, we can leave Bernasol through the sewers. I know a way that leads to the Doe Lake in the Erucher forest." Sewers. Carglass suddenly remembered that Erucher used to be a military stronghold on the way to Vero. There were complete sewers and defensive facilities here, but that was at least a century ago. He couldn't help but be surprised. "How do you know?" Micaiah lowered her head and whispered, "That's my home." My God, Carglass couldn't help but sigh. Poor child, why didn't the Lord take you away? You're better off in Tonajul than here. It's not Mr. Brando's fault, Micaiah replied, I didn't want to. My parents are here, and I don't want to leave them. Carglass shook his head, but Heroes looked at Micaiah suspiciously. He had a feeling that the latter was not telling the truth. At the very least, when did she see Master again? In any case, Carglass agreed to the proposal. They didn't know how many attackers there were in Bernisel, and the situation in the town wasn't clear. The best choice was to leave this dangerous place for the time being, especially with Heroes' status. However, Heroes was still worried about Sheeta, but Carglass didn't care. That guy disappeared early in the morning. God knows where he went. But, no buts, Your Highness Heroes. Sheeta is still a dragon. A cowardly dragon won't be a problem. Carglass' tone was full of sarcasm when he mentioned the word cowardly. Miss Lismika and the others weren't at the banquet, so they shouldn't be affected. We should move to a safe place as soon as possible and contact them, so they won't be in danger because of us. Heroes nodded and agreed to the proposal. The Violet Earl's mansion was originally a converted barracks in Fort Bernisel. Although it had been demolished and rebuilt several times after the Year of Iron Feather, the interior structure still retained much of its original design. Other than for defensive purposes, it was also used as a temporary shelter. Today, it was apparent that this function had come in handy. Although half of the mansion had collapsed on the surface, the interior of the Count's mansion was still astonishingly large. The corridors and winding corridors twisted and turned, and if one didn't have someone familiar to lead the way, it would be easy to get lost. But for its original owner, this obstacle naturally didn't exist. Soon, Eek led his wife and daughter to a path that led to the basement of the mansion. The corridor was very dark, and the doors of many rooms were wide open. The maids and attendants had all escaped when the chaos began, but Eek didn't know how many of them could have escaped safely, nor did he know how many intruders there were in Bernisel town. The patrolling cavalry and town guards hadn't moved yet, and this made his heart sink. It was supposed to be a peaceful night outside the Earl's mansion, but this night wasn't peaceful. Flashes of light exploded in the night sky from time to time, and cries of murder and despair could be heard from afar. This uneasy and oppressive night was especially heavy. He led his wife Yura through the long corridor, accompanied by only 2 attendants. Fortunately, there was still a wet nurse in the mansion who hadn't escaped in time. She was now holding their daughter Ilera. Strangely enough, the baby girl was sleeping soundly in such an atmosphere, as if she wasn't affected by the surrounding environment at all. When Eek looked back from time to time and saw his daughter's quiet little face, his heart calmed down a lot. He held his wife's hand tightly, feeling the warmth from Yura's hand. Yura didn't say a word, but all her feelings were already expressed in silence. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.